Hello, good evening, and welcome to broadcasts from Fiddler's Green. This is my weekly podcast where I discuss a variety of things, mostly revolving around the American and, just Western culture war, if you're new here. But I don't really have a distinct plan for tonight's talk. I posted the question about what I should be talking about to my Telegram channel, and I got a suggestion from two friends. One Millennial Woes, and the other was, I don't actually remember who gave this suggestion, but it was to comment on another one of my online friends, the Traditionalist. He made a post recently, I think actually it was just the other day, yesterday. He made a post recently discussing, ruminating and meditating on the blogger, the professional blogger Pedro Gonzalez's tweet about how the dissident right really was over, that it was in a process of dying, largely because people had started listening to it. It had been absorbed into the mainstream. Maybe preemptive, but it kicked off a really wonderful discussion. The suggestion from Millennial Woes, tightly related to this, was that I do a discussion about the nature of subcultures, and specifically comparing how subcultures exist today, or don't exist, to how subcultures existed in the 1990s, which is, I think, when most people, at least of our generation, remember subcultures existing. And I thought this was just a really delicious juxtaposition. So, via way of talking about the distant right and its supposed dissolution, I'll talk about subcultures. And this is really interesting. I spent about a few hours today thinking and doing a little bit of preliminary research about where subcultures came from, how they developed. If you think back to the 19th century, the idea of there being subcultures in Victorian England seems a little bit out of place. It doesn't seem exactly what was going on when we think about Victorian cliques or societies. These were usually either formal organizations of friends, tightly knit societies based around interests, or just groups of people who met regularly and discussed things. You can see this evolving a little bit, and I think you could argue something like, the Bohemian movement might have been the first subculture that Europe experienced. These were groups of young men who moved to Paris in the early 19th century, which was there's a send-off to it in the late 90s in the movie Moulin Rouge, which directly compared the sort of grunge subculture of the 90s to what was going on in Paris, which probably wasn't very accurate at all. What carves out the 20th century subcultures and distinguishes them from earlier groups of people who met and did things was these are broad cultures set around pieces of consumer culture. Mostly the people in subcultures don't know each other. They just have a set of common interests. And what made the 20th subcultures specifically distinct, I think, sets them aside from sort of the bohemians and other groups of artists that were really out and about in the 18th and 19th centuries, is that these were all organized around consumer products. And I think this really did not come into effect until the advent of mass culture, really starting in the 1940s, maybe a little bit in the 30s, but only really taking root in the 50s and 60s. The beatnik generation probably was the first subculture we can think of. And this also gets us to sort of the subculture cycle. The beatniks, and it's kind of funny that I come from talking about Holden Caulfield and Catcher in the Rye last week to now arriving at the beatniks. But the beatniks were simultaneously the first adolescent organized. It was the first sort of post-war subculture. And it was also the first subculture largely organized around adolescence and consumption habits based on things like rock. I mean, I don't think rock and roll was really a distinct thing yet, but things like jazz and slam poetry was initially invented there, and alternative authors like Ginsberg and Kerouac and stuff like that. And what was sort of immediately apparent about it was, I think what became apparent was initially what the beatniks saw themselves as was critics of the mainstream that were going to eventually facilitate some kind of revolution in culture. They were going to awaken America. America had gone to sleep after World War II. It had rested its revolutionary mission to reform the entire world. And looking back to earlier thinkers and earlier movements that had emerged in the 1930s, the beatniks saw themselves as really revivifying the revolutionary spirit that had been returned to in sort of New Deal America, and bringing forth some kind of new vision of America that would radically depart from the bourgeoisie normalcy that you saw in the 1950s. And really from this is where you get the pattern of subcultures. I think that you see in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then finally 90s. And the pattern that emerges is some new piece of artistic expression comes onto the form, whether it's initially something like folk culture in the early beatnik movements, what would later become phenomenons like Bob Dylan, but which started out as Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and all that stuff. Eventually, rock and roll filled this niche. And then later on, various forms of rock and roll and various increasingly radical forms of politics. But the form of the pop culture always would be some new radical or reimagined piece of culture would emerge onto the scene explosively. It would immediately be surrounded by people who were really passionate about it and who wanted to create in the mode. And then it eventually would become mainstream. People would absorb the tropes. They would eventually become acclimatized to its message. It would become part of popular culture properly. And then people, it wouldn't necessarily immediately die, but it would recede into the cultural background as it could no longer be presented as something that was revolutionary and that was disruptive, and that was going to become some kind of permanent way of life. It was not going to become a reimagined way of living in America. It was simply going to become part of a period, part of a progression. There's this excellent essay. I don't remember who wrote it. I think it comes from the blog Meaningness. It was featured prominently in Skeptical Waves a few weeks back, or a few months back, actually. I think actually at the beginning of the year, now that I think about it. But it discussed the pop culture cycle. It's called Geeks, Mops, and Sociopaths. And it describes the path that all subcultures have. First, what happens is they have a Promethean generation. The core creators build, they discover the new thing, they elaborate on the new thing, and they create something that's really interesting and exciting. What happens then is geeks come in. That's, I think, what the author uses the word geeks, and these are sort of pseudo creators. They don't create as much as the initial artists, but they do so a little bit. And moreover, what they do is they attract fanatics, and fanatics are people who are true believers, who just want to. They basically the subculture dominates their lives. It creates their identity for them. They want to live inside of it, and this creates a scene that eventually attracts people of declining passion, declining vivacity, declining dedication to the cause. And you get the emergence of mops who just want to come and have a good time and sort of soak up the good feeling that are created between the artists and the geeks. And eventually, the mops will take over the entire endeavor. And people, the last generation of people to come in will be sociopaths who just want to exploit the subculture, exploit the cool thing that is built around so that they can get more popularity and clout and make money. And at that point, the subculture either is absorbed immediately into the mainstream or it just plain dies. And this is the cycle that goes on. I think this is the subculture cycle. The thing is that when I did research on the idea of subcultures this week, I really mean last night, I looked at what a lot of people said about subcultures, and I looked at what they were talking about, like what was the first subculture. And they all put the emergence of subcultures in like the 70s or 80s, even though to me, the cycle described in the Geeks, Mops, and Sociopaths essay, that cycle really was immediately apparent in the subcultures that emerged much earlier in the 1950s, 60s, and maybe even as early as the 30s. So I did some thinking about this, and I think the story about why the subculture phenomenon eventually died in the 2000s and the 1990s became more apparent. The beatnik generation did not see itself as a subculture as such. They saw themselves as a revolution. They saw themselves as a revolution in waiting. And the 60s, the emergence of the 60s from the 50s, from the beatnik culture, really just encourage this perception. Okay, sure, maybe folk is out and rock and roll is in. Maybe it's no longer Woody Guthrie, it's Woodstock, and then later it's Led Zeppelin, later it's a reimagined social justice outlook in the 1970s. Maybe that's the progression, but it's all part of some revolutionary edge. What had not yet emerged as part of this phenomenon was this idea that the revolutionary would never really come. What was being done, what was progressing, was simply a path by which ideas that were originally found in some kind of leftist subculture would slowly become mainstreamed and absorbed into the main culture. The path of taking beatnik ideas and revolutionary ideas in the 50s and making them pop culture in the 70s, or taking revolutionary ideas in the 60s and making them pop culture in the 80s, this was part of a conveyor belt. There would never be a moment where the pillars would shake and capitalism would be overthrown and some kind of radical new way of life would emerge. The subculture way of life was what was being produced. And I think the final rebellion of this was in the punk movements of the 1970s. This is the Sex Pistols and the Clash. I always remember Clash's opening song in their seminal album, London Calling, when they say, "Phony Beatlemania has bitten the dust." They're literally sweeping away the revolution of the 60s because it's fake, and they're reinstituting another revolution, which is the punk revolution. This is the revolution that's going to take itself seriously. And punk was the element of beat culture that realized very early on the cycle of subcultures, from subculture artists, geeks, and creators to eventual mops and sociopaths. And their whole point was to try to arrest this, to try to make their revolutionary zeal something that would be eternal, something that you could always, that would not rest. The sword will not rest in our hand until Eden is created in England's good and green land. The punks were, in some sense, the Neo-Puritans, and it's not surprising that they came out of the exact same boroughs of London and Oxford and Cambridge, right? Although mainly London for the punk scene, but it's probably the ancestors of the Puritans, and they had more or less the same attitude. The reformations of the past were a lie. Now let us create new reformations that will really take themselves seriously. Really, guys, punk music is essentially a Puritanism for the rock and roll generation. And that's why hardcoreness, which is really devotion, is so prized in the punk community. This, I think, burns itself out multiple times when you go from the Sex Pistols to the Clash to the Ramones to Rancid to the emergence of punk again in the 1990s, when you get people like, obviously, it sort of transforms from punk to grunge. And once you encounter subculture the way all of us 90s kids remember it, I think Millennial Woes is really remembering the subculture scene in the 1990s more than anything else. And I remember going through high school. Some people tell me that these streams are too personal, but I always like relating them to personal anecdotes. But in my own hometown, which was not Berkeley, but I always felt it was kind of an orbital of Berkeley, an orbiting moon of Berkeley. It was a very bourgeoisie existence, despite the fact that it was incredibly blue and incredibly academic. And there was one place in town, there was one cafe that really felt like it could have been airdropped in from Berkeley, California. And I remember this because it was where me and my friends used to hang out and play games, usually Magic the Gathering, but that's more or less immaterial. It was where all the nerdy kids went and hung out and played because it was right next to the comics and card shop. But it was also where all like the punk kids hang out and stayed up till all hours of the night, going out periodically to smoke marijuana and then coming back in to drink coffee for hours and hours and hours, because this place was opened late and it was illuminated like an airport lounge. This was before the reign of Starbucks. There was no dimmed lighting. This place was filthy, and you could see every inch of it was filthy. And it was in this place that I kind of first came in contact with this idea that, oh man, we're on the outside of things. We're not part of the mainstream. But these people, and really for myself, it was more of the geeks than grunge and the punk crowd that occupied the same, or later the goths. it was really more those guys than the latter. But you could really feel the idea of patented rebellion organized around consumer products in this place. The fact that all the communities ran together to a certain extent didn't really hurt that perception. But the point is that I kind of went in that space very slowly to absorb all sorts of interests in things like Nirvana and alternative music, Smashing Pumpkins, and all these ideas and this concept of being authentic and not selling out. It's funny because I really encountered the scene really late in high school, much later than I should have. Actually, I mean, it was actually early in high school, but really later. The scene was dying by the time I encountered it. But still, there was the vapors. In the 90s punk scene, there was this idea that there was authentic music, and then there was music that was pop, that was selling out, that was kind of giving in to the corporate impulse that had devoured rock and roll in the 1980s. And really, to be an authentic person, you really needed to maintain your principles and listen to stuff that would really embody a revolutionary spirit. And it was important that your tastes not be too mainstream. And it was important also that the bands that produced them not be too mainstream. It was important that they at least maintain an aura of detachment from what was going on around them, from being popular. And I remember even, it's so funny because I believe this. I believe that there was this revolutionary spirit and this authentic nature of the artist that lay behind all of the music I liked, and my kind of idea of me being involved in nerd culture also, that was part of it. But at the same time, I knew something was wrong, right? Because what was the point of all of this if not to expand the message out, if not to spread the popularity of the thing in question? This is obviously a conflict that Kurt Cobain ran into very early. It was at the end of his career. But how can you be a rebel against the cause once you've totally mainstreamed yourself, once you've gotten popular, once you've made it big? And if you're not trying to do that, what's the point of your career anyway? I think the punks had convinced themselves that the point of punk music was to sort of conquer the entire sphere of pop culture, and this would somehow facilitate a revolution. What they weren't prepared for is that's not how pop culture works. Pop culture works or cultural movements work, or cultural modes work, by slowly getting themselves absorbed into the mainstream culture. Grunge could work. Kurt Cobain could get his ideas injected into the mainstream, and he did. He was one of the most influential cultural figures of the 1990s, and he set the stage from everything that came afterwards. But what his successful the question was, once Kurt Cobain's ideas became mainstream and became cool and became things that people would adopt, even though they were total plebeians, what did they actually mean? What did they actually mean when they could no longer be described as rebellions? What could they actually mean when they could no longer describe themselves as the bottom of the barrel, as the rebellion striking up against the man? And it turned out to everyone, it turned out to Kurt Cobain ultimately that they didn't mean very much at all. I mean, I think they did mean a lot. But the message, Nirvana's message disaggregated from his pretense of being a rebel and a revolutionary was simply this very, very ugly and pure strain of misanthropic nihilism. There was this conflict between Nirvana and I think Guns N' Roses. And iHypocrite, the YouTuber iHypocrite, did a great video on this. And Guns N' Roses kind of walked into the 1980s, hey guys, we're rebels, but we're also here to have a good time. Kurt Cobain wanted to take the revolutionary zeal and spirit seriously. And because of that, this necessitated Kurt Cobain maintaining this really stupid and personal grudge against Guns N' Roses and Axl Rose and all those guys. And It's kind of really infantile when you think about it, but not so much when you consider the fact that this was Kurt Cobain's religion. He believed he was bringing forth some kind of revolutionary generation, and the fact that this would somehow dovetail with corporate rock was anathema to that. But the problem is that, again, once Kurt Cobain could no longer conceive of himself as a rebel against anyone, potentially his own wife notwithstanding, the true message of Nirvana was that suicide was really the answer. There was nothing beyond that. There was sort of a pop activism that you could pursue. There was sort of you could vote Democrat, right? You could listen to Nirvana, and you could pull the lever for Bill Clinton, later for Al Gore, and much later for Barack Obama. But was that what was being promised? Is that what Kurt Cobain is raging against? He's raging, he's sitting there in the 1990s and he's raging against the machine, no pun intended. He's raging against the reality of modern American life. And the culmination of his disappointments is that more radical Democrats weren't elected into office. The culmination of his objections to the system that cages him in is the fact that there isn't universal health care. We don't have France-style public HMOs. That's the problem. And of course, none of it made sense. The message of Kurt Cobain's music is there is a much deeper dissatisfaction with life. And of course, that couldn't survive its own irony. That couldn't survive its absorption into mainstream, except as a form of self-destruction. And this sort of brings us, again, to the jumping off point where I found subcultures. In the 90s, subcultures died because the path subcultures took from fanatics to mops was accelerated. And the internet helped accelerate this a lot. There was no gap between when people discovered something that was cool and when everyone discovered when something was cool. There was a little bit in the 2000s, and this was really the golden age of the hipster. But even in the 2000s, the gap was really, really small because of the presence of Internet 1.0. So that led to sort of the frequent, the mantra of the hipster millennial was, I was doing X before it was cool. Meaning I was doing X before everyone started doing X, and this somehow becomes my identity. The problem is the politics of voting for Democrats and the politics for embracing ideology that was really the ideology of the mainstream writ large was an ever cascading and an ever transient identity that marched forward in time until we get to the place where we are now, where all subcultures were centralized and devoured by aggregators like Tumblr and Web 2.0. Tumblr is a good example of this because it showed how the purity spiral worked in real time. People would get onto a fandom and as fanatics and stay fanatics, and immediately the ultimate conclusions of the message of that would emerge from the woodworks. Another essay that you can find on Skeptical Waves was the essay on how the fandom of Glee on Tumblr in many ways prefigured what we would see as modern fandom woke, or modern fan communities wokeism of the variety you'd see on places like Steven Universe communities. The cycle gets too large, and what happens is again, the process is what happened, I think, is that it really goes back to the 1950s and all of this. What you're seeing, again, I don't actually think that subcultures have ceased to exist. The problem with subcultures, and I know this is very rambly, is that they go too fast. They are born and they go through their adolescence and they get mature and they die in a matter of months. A process that would have taken years and would have given people a seemingly solid place to ground their identities simply fade away into the ether almost instantly. And as such, everything seems transient and meaningless. And it's because of the initial lie of the entire endeavor. The initial lie of the entire 50s, 60s, and 70s was that emerging counterculture, pop culture, and we now know that almost all counterculture was pop culture, just in a nascent proto form. All counterculture and pop culture is going to be transient and die. It's not a replacement for solid identities. My grandfather, who really had a very limited intersection with what we would now call subcultures, he was a dedicated Catholic. He had a community of men that he would hang out. Even sounds strange. He would do things with. He would work with them. He would go out to baseball games with them. This was his community of people. And the same thing true for my grandparents on the other side. They would have their ethnic community. But ethnicity and the ethnic communities from the old country, from the old European country, language communities, racial communities. But in the 1950s and 60s, these ethnic communities were dissolved. They were destroyed in the cities. They were consigned to suburbs where they could no longer really exist. And they were replaced by pop culture communities, by subcultures. And the reason why this seemed like an exchange that made sense was that there was sort of this exchange. The time horizon was too large to see that these things would not be a solid place to put your identity. The person who thought that rock and roll defined their lives in the 1960s would outgrow it in the 70s, and it would be a mere fascination for them. And if you're the baby boomer generation, who's really the only generation where this absolutely worked, you could kind of ride these trends all the way to the end. In some ways, the movie Forrest Gump embodies this. Forrest Gump is a movie about a very dim man who just rides pop culture trends from one end of his life to the other. He gets captured by whatever is going on in the mainstream news from one end of the baby boom generation to the very end. And that's just his entire life, and it somehow makes sense, even though it doesn't at all. And he doesn't need any identity except for the fact that he just does what he thinks is right in the moment. But of course, that's fine if you're Forrest Gump and each of these little pop culture epochs characterize chapters of your life. It's much harder when there are memes that are, that take life at the beginning of one week and end at the very next. It's very different when there are political movements that have relevance on one side of a presidential election, but not on the other. Right now, ultimately, the inheritors of the 1960s or the 1950s counterculture is the left, is the modern left, and it's dead. I mean, it really is dead. I think that I am ultimately going to talk about the dissident right, but let's pause a little bit here and say, everyone here is probably feeling right now that everyone's burnt out on politics. Everyone is tired of doing politics in the classic way or figuring out where they stand in terms of identity and culture and all this stuff. I think that streams like this are doing very well, but you notice that there's this feeling of stillness and tiredness and no one really knows what to do anymore. And the problem is that the ball is really in the left's court. They got what they wanted. BreadTube got their guy elected, and far from being a Bill Clinton, he incorporates an enormous number of their ideas into his political platform. Case in point, just this week, Joe Biden decided that he would partially forgive an enormous amount of student loan debt, presumably by printing money and causing inflation, or maybe raising taxes. It's not quite clear, but presumably those IRS agents they had to hire were going to have to tax somebody. And it looks like this week also it's going to start with people who make more than $600 on eBay or Patreon or Subscribestar, which might be me. So this is essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul. More to the point, it's robbing people who aren't in the Democratic coalition to pay people who are in the Democratic coalition, those people the people being paid being much more wealthy and much more affluent than the people who are being taxed on average. And the left wanted this. they lobbied for it, and they got it. And now we're in the position of Kurt Cobain. Is this really what you wanted? This is the reality. This is the end of the revolution. This is the reform that would eventually lead to socialism. Accumulated buyouts, accumulated gives, paid by, I should say, printing money, fiat currency, and taxes on independent businesses. I mean, to some degree, they're probably happy they're getting these incremental changes that make them marginally more wealthy. But at the same time, everyone knows that this isn't solid. This is transparently fake. It feels fake. It feels like it's something that's unworthy, that can't possibly give ground and give life. This isn't a new world. This isn't some solid piece of eternal truth. This isn't some solid piece of eternal beauty. What they were really asking for was was a very, very petty desire. Just like when Kurt Cobain was alluding to some kind of revolutionary change in his Nirvana songs early on in his career, he was basically just asking to be a rock star, like Axl Rose, like Van Halen, like U2. That's what he was asking for. That was what his revolution really generated. And at the post end of success, you have to turn around and say, okay, well, this is a political movement. It's achieved its end. And if you like the end of the political movement, then, be happy. And if you don't, get wrecked. And the left can't do that because the left's been lying to its adherents, and they've been saying, no, we're going to rebuild a new solid world for you, where you're going to have what your grandparents had and your great-grandparents had and your parents had, but better, but solider, but more pleasurable. You're going to have a solid identity that's going to give you value and it's going to give you meaning. You are going to have a way to feel like you're part of a community, to feel like you really have a purpose in life. And you're going to be able to carry this throughout your entire life. This was literally the promise of people like El Chapo Trap House. They had this whole episode about Jordan Peterson. And he said, the whole problem with Jordan Peterson is he doesn't understand politics. It was actually a very similar objection to the right-wingers of the time. So that the problem with Jordan Peterson is he doesn't understand politics. And if you can get some meaning by cleaning your room and by being a good boy and by improving yourself and exercising. But what will really give your life meaning is pouring yourself into the cause. And I promise you, I remember Matt Kreisman, it's Kreisman, right? Or Christman, he looks in the camera and he says, I promise you, if you pour your life into the cause, it will be much more fulfilling than just cleaning your room and making yourself better and getting your life in order. And it'll do much more good for other people because you'll be thinking about someone outside of yourself. Man, that hasn't aged well. Because ultimately in success, we can see how hollow that is. The point of all political movements is to abolish themselves by abolishing the problem they confront. The point of all successful wars is to end. And I think this is something that at least the right understood that. At least the right understood. The dissident right, to a certain extent, understood. And earlier, the alt-right understood. The point of itself was to abolish itself and to become the mainstream. And as such, it could not be a surrogate for a religion, the way that the left constantly promises its adherents it will be. It cannot be a surrogate for meaning in family and community and ethnicity and groundedness in history. It would always be a transient political push. The point of a political movement is to abolish itself. Now, people are now saying that the dissident right should abolish itself or has abolished itself because people have listened to it. Pedro Gonzalez made an article this week saying how the dissident right had enough mainstream representation now that it couldn't really exist any longer as a subculture. It had mainstreamed, and now that it had advocates like himself, there was nothing really else it could say. I mean, there were things it could say, it could move on. but it couldn't exist really as a pop culture in the same way that it had before. Prudentialist in his essay, and I really encourage people just to read it. I have the link in the description this time. Honest. Prudentialist walked through a number of ways that could happen. And I think that, I don't know, I think it's a little bit premature to declare a victory like that. And it's important, I think, to realize that victory will feel like that. Victory does feel like self-abolition. The point of the dissident right is to abolish the mainstream right to the point where it can't come back in any meaningful way. That's the grand unified point, and also to abolish centrism of the Adam and Sitch variety, to prove definitively how impotent it is, and what a scam it is, because movements that aren't trying to abolish themselves are scams. At some point, you have to say to yourself, okay, I understand the point you're making. We've got to move on to the next thing. I understand that the social justice warriors are stupid. I understand that Bosch uses dishonest arguments. I understand that those wokies are crazy. I understand that, we need fiscal responsibility in the case of the normie Republicans. But this is not something that, your business model as a centrist or as a Republican is to maintain this outrage indefinitely and not come to the inevitable conclusions that the dissident right was pushing. The dissident right's main contributions to the mainstream was to show, there is a consistent leftward force in history, of which the Republican Party and the mainstream right is part of. Not only that, they have very recently, as soon as the 60s, fully embraced the underlying logic and arguments that have directly led to the wokest explosion and to the modern left as it exists today. 2, or 3, I can't remember what exact point I'm on, this domination by leftist ideology can absolutely smash any mainstream right-wing position that's brought against it. It's designed to do that because most of the things that it relies on to facilitate its growth are either embraced by the right already, as previously mentioned, or rely on certain pieces of wrong things, certain things that you can't publicly say, such as, the civil rights movement in many ways was a huge mistake. Or I should say, a lot of things that came out of the civil rights movement were huge mistakes. You can quibble over which ones. But an enormous amount of the logic that came out of that period was totally mistaken about the nature of how America worked and how minority communities could actually be helped. And not to mention questions about demographics and statistical differences between groups, which is always and forever the third rail of politics for the right. All of these things, all the things that could lead away from leftist conclusions in a meaningful way, are all anathematized. They're all either contained inside dialectics that naturally favor the left because the left is handing out goodies, or they're sort of hidden behind taboos. They're hidden behind scare words like fascist, racist, reactionary. And, anyone who exists inside this dialectic and plays by its rules is inevitably just going to be part of the leftist apparatus, part of the body of Cthulhu that's consistently moving left. And in order to be meaningfully distant, in order for it to be meaningfully disentangled from the left's project, what you need to do, both in style and in content, is just to make a hard break with the assumptions, all assumptions of the liberal world order. It's to reject them outright. It's not to say that every single conclusion that comes from a liberal's mouth is wrong necessarily. It's not to say that the virtues that the men of the Enlightenment pursued were false, or even necessarily that some of the tools they were using aren't useful and couldn't be incorporated into something new that comes about. But it's to say that the mode of their thought, the propositions that they made about value-neutral societies, about people organizing themselves in terms of self-government, apropos of no guiding religion, framework, or king, The idea that you could just wave a magic wand and perfectly integrate America, or that the integration itself wouldn't immediately melt away the distinctiveness, the richness, and the functionality that we recognized from the old world. All of these things, all of these modes of thought have serious problems with them and need to be rejected outright. And because of that, participation in the system to a certain degree has to be walked away from. This is the ultimate message of the dissident right. I think ultimately people like Pedro Gonzalez and R.N. McIntyre and the Traditionalist are carrying it forward in a really admirable way, in a very effective way. But I don't know. I think it's going to take a generation. I mean, I'm not trying to prolong this. Believe me, I would like nothing more than just to say the dissident right is done. Mission accomplished. Let's abolish ourselves. The problem I see mainly is that people say, okay, we're done with the dissident right. And as I've said many times before, the first thing they do after they say we're done with the dissident right is they try to recreate the old normie Republican mode. For instance, just today on Twitter, I saw someone say, okay, we're done with the dissident right. And the biggest problem with the dissident right is that they're too afraid of incremental change. And as soon as I read that statement, I immediately I kind of clasped my forehead and questioned what I've been doing with my life. If again, the problem is so subtle, right? The problem is so subtle because I'm not against small victories. If you can get them, take them. But the mentality of there's a difference between pursuing small victories and getting breathing room for yourself and making stopgaps, and then incremental change. There's a gap here, and the problem is that the use of the word incremental change or small steps to victory, it belies the entire problem that the dissident right has been trying to point out from step one when it emerged on the scene in the late '80s. You cannot use this kind of logic against the left generally. You cannot incrementally reform things via a process of conservation. What you're buying for yourself with small victories are gaps. They're gaps in time, they're gaps in resources, inside which you can try to build something different, inside which the right wing itself can essentially declare itself to be finished and begin something new that's Promethean, that actually has another vision for the future, that will certainly incorporate many elements of what we now call right-wing ideas, and some elements of what we call left-wing ideas, but we'll see it as something that is completely new, that is turning over an absolutely new leaf. The idea that you can incrementally take steps backwards within the framework of electoral reform, or the idea that you can incrementally reform the universities, which is another thing that I saw coming out of the student loan conversations. This demonstrates to me that you might mouth platitudes about being done with the Republican Party, or you might retweet R.N. McIntyre's tap the sign tweets about the side that wants to win will always defeat the side that just wants to be left alone. But it shows to me that you still don't really understand what's going on about the system that we're part of. The dissident right wins not when it abolishes itself to make incremental reform, but the dissident right wins when it abolishes itself and finds many groups of people who are willing to make new things, who are willing to strike out in new Promethean directions, who say, okay, look, this system isn't working, let's find one that is working and go with that. We want community so that we can actually pursue the eternal things that will always be valuable to us. How can we do that? How can we actually defend the things that we love, defend the things that are real for us, and actually survive into the future? That is the mentality. And maybe that does involve making small victories. Maybe that does involve taking tiny steps forward. But that's not normie conservatism. That's not, oh, hey, like Mark Ruffo promises us that this is the final straw, guys, and now we're going to take all the straws out of the camel's back and we'll be back in 1985 in no time. There's no going back to 1985, there's no going back to 1955, and there's no going back to 1905. The only way is forward, and that's the framework that has to be taken. And this kind of gets me, I think, to the conclusion of this, the conclusion of where this brought me in my thinking. To a certain degree, you could say that in many ways, the task of the right wing at this stage is to create a variety of different subcultures, but kind of subcultures in the opposite direction. The subcultures that came out of the left-wing movement in the 1950s were transient subcultures. They were subcultures of mass scale, of consumerism, of mass appeal. And because of that, they were always transient cultures. And the fact that they were transient cultures, going from, the creators and the fanatics to the mops and the sociopaths and their life cycle, it made them fun and made them exciting, and it gave the boomers this kind of Forrest Gump existence. The point of the right at this stage, you could see it, I suppose, is making subcultures that work in the exact opposite way, that are organized around eternal things, that are made out of stone, that never change, or at least never change inside the life of the people that are actually participating in them. You could say, in some sense, that the Amish, or tightly knit religious communities like the Hasidim, or whatever, these people have their geniuses and their creators and their mops and their sociopaths. In broad sociological strokes, maybe you could make that case, but it really doesn't work in the same way. If there is a cycle of fanatics, of creative energy to dissipation inside these static groups, inside these long-lasting groups, it's not something that takes down the culture itself. It's a cycle that the culture has learned to live within. And because of that, you could say that the right wing's task is to create these permanent fixtures of subcultures. And that's the way to actually go forward. But more than that, the point, and this is obviously very hard to express, the point of the dissident right is to learn how to actually intentionally abolish itself and abolish ourselves as conscientious right-wingers. Again, I'm not saying that right-wing principles are not true. For the most part, they are. Right-wing politics is a better model of politics, and what is in this age described as right-wing morals are just sound human morals and will never die. But the whole idea of a right-wing political movement and a right-wing political activist needs to die in our own imaginations. We need to be in a constant process of abolishing ourselves and abolishing our own movement. And we need to learn sort of this sublime desire not to let this affect us. To see the edifice of Western civilization being torn down before us, and to kind of be fine with that. I'm actually serious, but I understand that George Washington is going to get torn down in my life. And I'm fine with that. I understand that many Catholic communities are going to be completely smashed in my own lifetime. And I don't like it. I understand that it's evil. But it's the world that I live inside. Right now there's a storm going on outside. And it kind of creates this ominous background. I don't think you can hear it above the ventilation system that I'm next to. But it's not part of the actual story that I'm participating in. It's just the details of the world that are going on around me. The Promethean perceives the chaos around him not as doom, but as just a storm that's raging outside. It's just the background and the palette upon which he creates a new world. I don't think that I ever, in my own lifetime, can affect that change. And so my task in this process, my task as a blogger, as a creator, as someone who's talking to you right now, is to simply preserve the good ideas and to maybe start create some seeds of new ideas that will be carried forward from a generation that can fully disentangle their own emotions from the old world that is now dead or dying. We have to be all right with the death of the old world. Just this week, there was this, and you can see this in multiple ways. There's actually, just looking at Twitter, there are two things that came up. There's obviously the student loans thing. And the student loans thing, immediately, full disclosure, I think it's horrible policy. It's robbing the rich to pay the poor, and it's bailing out the most corrupt elements of our society, mainly colleges, for really no reason. And there are better ways to handle it for sure. But I kind of got depressed seeing so many normie conservatives and so many people on the distant right raging against this. Because in this moment, the left they literally did this. You could see they're conscious of doing this. I don't know if people realize. They were conscious of doing this. They pulled out a seat and said, here, right-wingers, I want you to get angry at this. So for this month, you can be our villain of the day. Because they knew that a bunch of right-wingers getting angry about 24-year-olds who were fallaciously sold debt, like $80,000 of debt, they understood that right-wingers getting angry about that would shore up their support with young, active, really, let's not mince words here, energetic, intelligent young men. They would shore up their support because, oh yeah, the 40-year-old conservative with the student loan debt, the business owner with his debts paid off would get angry about the young professionals getting bailed out. And then what would the leftists do? They go right out, they get the PPE loans that were given to all these businesses that were taken up by the Daily Wire, and they'd show the receipts about how those debts were forgiven. It would be this big, it would be this easy slam dunk for the left. And so the left pulled this chair out to be their heel, and then the right just sat down in it. And for an entire week, they played the villain in the left's own framing of the problem. And then when I pointed out that they were wrong, I got a lecture on fiscal policy. And it's not that you can't object to this move. I object to this move, but the correct framing is, okay, why aren't the universities paying for it? That's all you should say about this. Why aren't the universities paying for it? To do anything else is to literally play into the framework where you're the less villain. And why are they doing this? Why are people who retweet all the distant right memes, why are they so eager to just log on and be the heel for left wing one more time so they can give 24-year-olds a lecture about debt management when we all know that the problem is the universities selling fallacious promises of higher earnings after a useless 4-year degree? The reason why they're doing this is they still think they're invested in the life of the old world. They say this is bad policy, and what do you do with bad policy? What do you do with irresponsible borrowers? Oh, well, you object loudly to bad policy on social media, and then you give the irresponsible youngins a good lecture about fiscal responsibility. This is nuts. This belies the belief that you are going to resurrect the old world. This belies the belief that you are going to actually get back 1985. Otherwise, why do you care? This is all coming out of a fiscal system. It's going to be paid by your taxes, but really, it's going to be paid by inflation. And to be quite honest, if it's not $45 billion poured into the university system, it's $45 billion poured into the corrupt weapons manufacturers and Ukrainian premiers for useless, endless wars. This money and this inflation lever is going to be cranked down as hard and as fast as they possibly can manage it without exploding the entire apparatus. In the meantime, if you want this to stop, you have to focus on discrediting the universities and tearing down the leftist power apparatus. Because trying to pull the fiscal state of a dead country out of the water, you can't do that. That's like you trying to rescue an elephant from drowning. You can't lift the elephant out of the water. The only thing you're going to do, short of having a forklift or some other kind of mechanical implement, is drown yourself. And if the elephant doesn't drown, it probably could have drowned without your help. And the same thing is true for this other thing people are objecting to. So there was this disgusting Netflix trailer. It was a Netflix Netflix France, that's a company, right? I would say French Netflix. French Netflix released this trailer called Athens or Athena. And it's this harrowing real-life story about how a civil war erupts in France between the noble African and Arab refugees and the evil racist French oppressors who want to put them down. And the fight erupts because one of the people was killed by a French police officer. And of course, it's hyper disturbing and hyper realistic, and it elicits all sorts of questions about colonization and about how the promises of immigration are absolute lies. And of course, Aaron McIntyre, in his usual form, had this really delicious tweet. He said, "This just exemplifies the right-wing conspiracy, theory to the left-wing Netflix docudrama pipeline. One minute they're saying you're crazy for thinking this ever would happen. The next thing, it's Viva la Revolution. The demographic replacement is happening, and now it's a good thing." Yeah, that's it. And of course, again, we were on Imagine if the shoe was on the other foot. The reaction to this should be, from right-wingers, I can't speak to France, because France, if any country could pull itself out of the water and continue existing, it probably would be France. They are by far the most conservative country on Earth, I would say. The nature of the French imagination is conservative. Even their notion of revolution is conservative in a lot of ways. But for the Anglophonic countries, the reaction to this should be to grab popcorn and to hear the left wing's own explanation of this. Let them run their mouths. Let them explain why this hell scenario is actually a good thing. And then let us tell our own stories about this hell scenario by literally taking cameras to South Africa and to some areas of France and to some areas of London and to Zimbabwe and to Haiti and to areas with real ethnic conflict. And then, ask the young and curious who's telling the more real story. Who's living in reality as it actually is? That's the only question we're asking. The only question we're asking is, are you living in reality as it actually is? Does our story about what demographic replacement will mean make more sense than Viva Revolution Che Guevara? Let's let Africans and Africans and Arabs reenact the Jacobin reign of terror in Paris. But this time it will be good. This time it will be just, because it's just pasty white people getting guillotined, man. It's just the pasty white people. Yeah, does that sound realistic? Does that sound like it will be noble and fulfilling? And the answer writes itself. I don't think anyone claims that this is going to be something that's beautiful. But it's transparently the left's child. It's transparently the reality we're bringing about. The problem is that the reaction belies that you have not severed yourself emotionally from the dying old world. There's nothing wrong about loving things from the old world. But if you love something from the old world, you'll love it just the same when France is in ashes as when it is a living country. If there's anything lasting about France, that good thing can exist in a world where France doesn't exist. I mean, I hate to say this, right? But this is more or less the conclusion that Augustine came to when he was looking at the sacking of Rome, and later as he was looking forward to the sacking of his own city, Hippo, which was, I think, immediately after his death, put to the torch. The good that exists in our life, if it is truly eternal, can exist after the death of the temporal things that we love. That doesn't mean that we have to stop fighting for them, and if we have a living stake in them, certainly if we've said vows to them, if there are families, if there are actual church communities, if there are actually people that put our faith in them, we have to fight for them, and we should fight for them. But we can't fight for the symbols of an old order that has already elected its own destruction. Can't do that. That has to die. It has to be moved away. And whatever comes after it has to be emotionally separated from what it is and what it has become. Absolutely emotionally separated from it. And the part of us that reaches out and screams, no, there has to be continuity. There always has to be Paris. That part of us has to die. Even our egos have to ultimately die. There's two books that I kind of remember in closing this out. The first one is me remembering the book Fahrenheit, the book Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, the story of Guy Montag. He's this. Well, they call him a fireman, but his real job is to flamethrower books, because in this future dystopia, all books are destroyed so that people don't remember what life was like or what the world was like before the advent of modernity. Books exist from the old world, and they have to be destroyed so you have nothing outside your frame of reference that you can compare your own life to, your own reality to, your own soul to. And eventually, through a variety of, kind of very predictable escapades that exist inside sort of these dystopian novels, Guy Montag finds himself on the outside of the society that's in the process of destroying itself, and that is furiously burning the past so that it can preserve itself. And he comes in contact with this alternative society of monks who are going to carry on the wisdom of the ages. And it's been like 15 years since I've read this book. But I remember as a kid hearing these monks talk, and what these monks have done is that they've each memorized one seminal book, like one work that they think should be carried over into the new world. That their entire job is just to memorize this one book. I remember reading this as a 19-year-old thinking, this is the stupidest thing ever. This is the stupidest thing ever. I mean, the whole point of books is like, you have a book here, you have a book here, you read it, as to have any good ideas, and you read the next book, and you read the next book, and you kind of mix and match and carry forward and create your own identity out of the patchwork of ideas that you have from many books. And now Guy Montag, this rebel against the oppressiveness of his own society, he's just going to memorize one book, and his entire life is just going to be to carry forward the legacy of that book, because the only way it can be really preserved is in memory? And the answer is yes. Because he has to believe that he is the product of a corrupt society, and the most he can give, if he truly believes that the books are valuable, part of his ego, a significant part of his ego, has to die so that eternal truth can carry on its existence, so that eternal truth can find its way into the next age. Another book that I remember, another work I remember, is Yukio Mishima. Again, I've read Yukio Mishima like in college, and all I remember are sort of like brief images and glimpses. But I recently rewatched the biography of Yukio Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters. And what stood out for me in there is it kind of takes his work and introduces them with one major theme, which is that the problem of sort of art, what he felt very distinctly in his own life, is that there's a separation between art and action. And action is vital, and it's real, and it's imminent, and it's true, and it's beautiful. And art is eternal. It's preserved. It's maintained. It will always be there for future generations, but it will always be a simulacrum. It will always be false. And Yukio Mishima, again, I don't remember this from reading his actual books. This is me. I mean, I really need to reread his books because I want to look for this theme inside of them. And I remember in broad strokes they're there. But Yukio Mishima believed that they could ultimately be unified in death. And This is what he said very famously in an interview, I think, to the BBC before his suicide. He actually pursued this end and committed seppuku, for those of you who don't know. Ceremonially, he had this fake, well, it's not really a fake coup, it was a real coup, but it was never intended to be successful. And at the end of it, he committed a seppuku ritual suicide to indicate his devotion to creating this new world, or as protest against the hollowness of modern Japan. And he said in an interview before his death, he said, I really do admire Christianity, but there's one thing I've never understood. He said, in Christianity, it seems that there's no way that you can kill yourself and win. Suicide is always a loss, but in Japanese culture, there's a way that you can end your life, and your life's end is sort of a victory over your own life's contradictions. I think he misunderstands Christianity a little bit differently. Christianity does preach ego death, but Christians do not consider our physical lives to be our own. So if you believe in a personal God who has a personal relationship with you as a believer, and I really hate the word personal relationship, but I have to use that to communicate it, then suicide is not itself a beautiful act, even if ego death is. Even if killing yourself and diminishing yourself so that Christ can become greater is. The act of suicide is not. And so I would say that Christians eminently understand this idea, that we ourselves have to become smaller so something living can become greater. And we pursue that. I don't think that many Christians really have fully embraced that. Certainly I haven't. But that's the promise. The dissident right is never stronger than when it's on the cusp of abolishing itself. It's never weaker than when it's something that seems like it can go on forever. And that's not to say that actual organizations, actual events aren't a fruit that can come from this mode of thought. But these meetups, even these conferences, and I know that they've just had the conference in England, the Witton conference. That's sort of the equivalent of the Sildings conference in the United States that I attend. They just had the most recent one of those. Hold on one second. They just had the most recent one of those, and the conversations are never better than when people think productively about what comes next, and not in the mode of critiquing the left. I know I critique the left a lot, but the criticisms always have to be in the form of what can we learn so that something new can come about. And the dissident right's never stronger than when it's in that mode. And people are commenting on the fact that they heard the dish crash in the background. I think someone broke something when doing dishes. This isn't the most sound tight area of the house. We don't have a very big apartment. And I think that's what people need to think. Whenever you think of yourself as an activist, always be abolishing your own activist movement. Always be building your own religious devotion. Always be creating families. Always be breaking ground on new projects, creating new texts, reading more poems, producing more podcasts even, if you want to. Always be building. Always be building what is real and what is eternal, but always be dismantling your own political movement. Every criticism you make of a leftist should set out to be the final criticism. You have to be striving to say, like, okay, now we know what this thing is, so that we can prevent ourselves from doing it, so that we can give it a name, so that other people can be reminded not to do it in the future, and that so we can go in a different direction. Every letter you write to another right winger has to be, okay, now we can put a demarcation point in this conflict, and everyone knows that this is what you're asserting, and everyone knows this is what I'm asserting. So now we can move on. I know I've had these conflicts with two communities in the right wing generally. Myself, the pickup artists, and the pagans. For me, I can never. I can enumerate my criticisms of these people, but I never feel like I really can get to an impasse. I can't recite their criticisms honestly, because it always feels like they're receding into the background. But that's the statement. We should always be trying to dismantle ourselves. So with that, I know that was sort of a strange talk tonight, but it was what I came up with. Hopefully everyone enjoyed it, and I can go on to the super chats now on Entropy. The Entropy link is in the description, and we can go on from there. Oops. Why is there sound? Why is there sound? Excuse me. The statement. We should always be trying. Pardon me, guys. I don't know why I should have had it on mute, but sorry for that brief echo. So the Entropy link is in the description, and I'll start answering the super chats now. So actually, before I hit it on the super chats, I have to confess, I did briefly look on an Adam and Sitch live stream because I saw that they were talking about Sam Harris, and I wanted to see what they were talking about. And I heard them as usual. Completely mischaracterize right-wing and nationalist beliefs. And I'm not even a nationalist. And I love to chat, and of course, Sitch completely spurgs out, and they both forget that they blocked me. And so they started inviting me on their stream, not remembering that they blocked me for being a bad faith right-winger, and they can't invite me. But nevertheless, I don't know what to say about the centrists. I guess it depresses me to see that there's still centrists around. There shouldn't be. This is. I mean, talk about a political movement that needs to abolish itself. This is something you'll see about centrists. Is this completely characterizes their movement? What eternal and solid things do Adam and Sitch believe? Like as eternal foundational visions. Eternal moral principles, eternal solid religious beliefs, convictions. Who are their people? Who do they have loyalty to? Who do they fight for? That's never clear. The only thing that's clear in Adam and Sitch's world is a variety of transient political platitudes that are repeated ad nauseum as sort of little comebacks and gotchas. They constantly dunk on the left, but I mean, the left's better than them. The left has a defined ideology. What the hell is their ideology? The things that they parade as their ideology are things like Jonathan Haidt's the moral, what is it? Not the moral landscape. That's Sam Harris's book. Oh God, I forget what it is. But the moral intuition theory. Jonathan Haidt's moral intuition theory. I forget the name of the book that he wrote it up on, even though it's literally on The Righteous Mind. It's literally on the bookshelf behind me. But they have platitudes, and they have scientific theories that they like. But scientific theories aren't worldviews. That isn't a holistic way of approaching the world. Two Adam and Sitch fans aren't going to have a common way of approaching the world. For instance, Aaron McIntyre and myself, we're both Christians. I don't know if we're I'm not a nationalist. But we're both traditionalists in the sense that we embrace traditional notions of the West and Christendom. We want to see preservations of traditional indigenous people everywhere, but in particular the West. And we have very, very common and consistent tools to approach ideas. And because of that, we can very quickly highlight where our disagreements are, where our disagreements on fact are, and come to a common plan forward. We communicate in very similar ways. And the same thing is true for me in The Prudentialist, myself even in Academic Agent, and to a certain degree Sargon too. We have a certain common language that we can approach things with. I have no idea what that language is for Adam and Sitch. Their entire worldview is just a set of zingers and fragments of scientific theory that are piled on top of each other and hopefully come together into something that's coherent enough for a live stream, but it's certainly not coherent enough for a lifestyle or a way of actually valuing things in your life. And because of that, their community is a complete mess. No two people believe the same thing, or will fight on the same side when the chips are really down. And again, they themselves have become a classic subculture of the 1990s variety. They're a culture built around consumption, and I guess as long as the personalities of Adam and Sitch are there, it won't go through the natural subculture death that you saw for things like Glee, but it will never become more than cults of personality around the creators themselves. And furthermore, it will eventually die. There's something eternal there. And I personally feel very, very sad about that. I think if you're a live streamer, if you're somebody who does the podcast game, every opportunity you have, you should be pointing to something that's more eternal outside of yourself. That's why I end all my podcasts with poetry readings or readings from the Psalms, because you can see the beginning of one of the Psalms that I'm going to read tonight in the description beneath me. Bonus money if you figure out what Psalm that is. I know you can type it in, but if you can come up with the Psalm number before I read it, that could be like a contest. If you write the number of the Psalm in at reply me, I'll read your super chat for free. How about that, right? How about that? Or I'll include the first stanza of the poem I'm going to read. But I'm digressing. The point of a live stream, the point of a podcast, the point of these parasocial relations should be to build real. The point of parasocial friendships should be to build real friendships. And I'm trying to do that with Cringewalker and Clausington, who I know in real life. To a lesser degree, other people that I meet once a year at the conferences, right? But I'm trying to do that more and more. And if I can't meet you in real life, the point of it should be to build our parasocial relationship as much as possible on things that aren't going to go away when the political cycle changes, that aren't going to go away when our consumption habits change, and that will provide some guide point for your life that is healthier than what you're ordinarily encouraged to believe by our utterly transient culture. And that's something that I think worthwhile podcasts like the Lotus Eaters offer. I mean, the Lotus Eaters, I know people don't like it. I like it. My wife really likes it. Her in-laws really like it. It's great stuff. But what I think makes it work is that Sargon, even though he's kind of doing outrage porn, well-produced outrage porn, I like the fact that he's trying to guide the inner circle of that podcast towards deeper ideas. And I think because of that, it sort of stands head and shoulders above Tim Pool and the rest of that crowd. But podcasts like that and Beauty, it's not Beauty and the Beta anymore. The Blonde and Matt Christendom show, right? The Blonde and Matt show, Blonde in the Belly of the Beast, that is. That's outrage porn too. I Hypocrites Can't Stop Progress is literally outrage porn. But I like the fact that the creators there, they're there to constantly remind the audience, okay, come for the outrage porn. You really should be looking at this deeper ideology. Aaron McIntyre and the Prudentialist, I think they have, in the Academic Agent, I think that they have a different tact, and that is to become more educators. And they will literally dedicate a lot of their work to educate people about well-developed ideas from the past. And that is something that's good. But, again, the point of that is obviously to abolish the need for yourself a little bit, right? Eventually people are going to catch on to what this idea is, and then, that product is going to recede into the background, obviously. And I think Aaron McIntyre is a wonderful educator. He's mastered the short form communication, which I never was able to do on Twitter. And because of that, he's a great content provider. But, the point of all of this is to always make the political recede and to always make the religious and eternal expand. And if we're not doing that, I think we're fundamentally grifters. Politics exists so that it can be abolished, so that we can destroy politics and get on to things that are more meaningful and productive in our own lives. We have to do politics to escape it. Unfortunately, that's our role as right-wingers. So I appreciate that. Anyway, on to the super chats. The first one of the night. Franz Neubauer. My wife is 6 months pregnant with my son, and I wanted to ask you for some thoughts and advice preparing for fatherhood. I'm in my late 20s and just started my career as a lawyer, so I expect to be under heavy workload for the next few years. Thanks for all you do. Greetings from Austria. By the way, do you speak German? I took 2 years of German in high school. I went to Germany for 4 months and tried to wing it there, but that was like 15 years ago, and it's all gone now. My father speaks fluent German. My grandmother and grandfather did. But unfortunately, I'm the generation that kind of lost that, unfortunately. So I tried to, I was at the point where I could read Max and Moritz, which is this delightful German book about two wickedly evil boys. And what is that other book, the other delicious German children's book? Oh, God, I forget. It's not Schwarzpeter. It's another Peter, but this one is, he's this unkempt boy who doesn't cut his fingernails, and they all become overgrown. And it's this list of cautionary tales that's really, really un-PC. I was able to read those in German enough to understand them, but I was always very rudimentary, and now it's just all gone. I'd have to really brush up on it. But, all right, well, let me see. I think the advice for new parents is, my main advice is this: your role as a husband is just to not to sweat the small things. I think this is true for all men, and I am making gendered stereotypes, or I should say sex stereotypes, or whatever one you prefer, because they're basically the same thing. In all, for people who, among people for whom language actually means things, gender and sex mean the same thing. But you will notice as a young father that the crying baby hurts you less than it hurts your wife. Your wife is going to be very, very distraught every time she hears the baby cry. And your baby is going to cry a lot, which means that the ordinary problems you have as a couple, like getting out the door to work or maybe dealing with an appointment that doesn't work out, that's going to be frequently exacerbated by the fact that very frequently your son's going to have a meltdown at the same time. Your primary role is going to be calming everyone down and making sure that they can see the big picture, and to kind of get a plan in order so that not everyone goes to pieces. And in addition to that, and this is something that I really feel like I had a hard time. I really feel like I didn't do this. The thing is to always make sure that you're in the moment with your child as much as possible. For myself, the first year we had my son, it was COVID years, and so the problem with the first 6 months of COVID is that you're constantly in this sort of state of shock, like, oh, we're going to come out of it now, right? We're going to come out of it now. And so, you kind of were always in your own head. You kind of always were scrolling to get through it all so that you could start living again. You weren't aware that this is just life now. This is just the world you have to live in. You just have to get over it. And because of that, my memories aren't as distinct for the first 6 months as they were for the second. But the other thing you have to remember is you just have to treasure he's never going to be an infant again. He's never going to be a newborn again. You're never going to be able to hold him in your arm like this after his first year. And so there's all these little moments, all these little firsts that you're going to be able to experience and that you want to remember, and it's important to be present for those. These days, I always have to remember to never check my phone when I'm out on walks with my son. I try to take him for a walk every day after I get home from work, and I never check my phone except to check the time. That's like, I always have to remember that. Don't scroll ever, because that's your time, and you want to be fully present in that time. I have the problem of kind of generally letting my mind wander, but that's something you should always keep in mind. And also, here's the thing: like changing diapers, it's a really easy chore, and you get a lot of credit for doing it. So I always sign up for that. I think it's a really easy thing to do. The easiest part about being a parent is changing diapers. The least easy part is them crying and not knowing why, or the constant fear that something bad is going to happen to the kid, like the whole SIDS thing that haunts your dreams as a young parent. And so I don't know. I think that's really uncommon, so probably don't sweat it. If you need like a security system that monitors their breathing, and that helps us sleep better, install that. But those are my tips for a new father. Anyway, yeah, I probably lost half of my audience just in that one little super chat. But I feel that's kind of necessary, right? All right. Belos Missillary. I'm learning German to eventually read Goethe and other classical works. Which language would you learn to read literature in its native tongue? Separately, do you think elites coordinate in secret societies, or are they simply alienated from the real problems of the plebeians? Well, I mean, I don't know. First of all, to answer your first question, I guess I already talked about how I didn't speak German anymore. If I ever knew it, I don't think 2 years and then a 4-month trip or a summer in Germany are really going to do it for me, right? But yes, I think that if I could speak, I don't know. Right now, I'm reading the Decameron, so I really want to read it in Italian. I think if I could speak one language fluently, just to read old text, it would obviously be Latin. I mean, maybe Attic Greek might be a close second, but who knows? But it's hard to know, right? I mean, learning a language well enough so that you can read a serious intellectual work, that's a very tall order. And it's something that I don't know. I don't have the time to learn a language right now, but it's a very noble endeavor. Right now, the Italian authors are standing out more in my mind than the German ones. Reading Schiller or The Sorrows of Young Werther is something that it's appealing, but I don't know. I was never the biggest Goethe fan. I read Faust, and I was good, but it wasn't something that changed my life, I think. So, thank you very much, Philos. I do owe you a live stream, so. Mim the Dwarf. Thanks for all the wisdom over the years, Dave. Even if it fails to internalize in most of us. An easy one for you this time. Any board or tabletop game recommendations? See, it's been a while since I played general tabletop games. My favorite tabletop, I mean, this depends on the audience. What you want to do is when you go to a tabletop board game night, you really want to read the audience. How hardcore are these people, and what will they really appreciate? Do they want something that's like strategy? Do they want something that's like an economic based board game, or do they want something where everyone can laugh? My favorite party games obviously are Exquisite Corpse and Celebrity, because they can be played with minimal amounts of investment. Party games I've also liked are Codename. Then there's more laid back ones. I think that the laid back board games that I've really appreciated are, I really hate Cards Against Humanity. I'm gonna say that right now. I think Cards Against Humanity is cheap laughs. I hate Cards Against Humanity so much that I've come to hate Apples to Apples, just because it is Cards Against Humanity with less racy things, and because of that, these word association games have really kind of, I don't know. Let's just get to Euro games. I think Goa is a great game, and Puerto Rico. Those are two of my favorite games that are sort of the Euro game variety. Obviously, Settlers of Catan is a popular one because everyone knows it. And then when you get into sort of like the deep gaming, my favorite game of all time, and so far as there's the deep gaming nerd game, would be Android Netrunner. But it's been a really long time since I played board games like in a group of people who were really hardcore gamers. For if you're in a group of hardcore gamers, I think that everyone plays against the board games are just generally really good. The one that originally introduced me to that style of game was Shadows over Camelot, which is a really hard game. But what's good about that is that it's super complicated, and you get to do a lot of strategy thinking, which appeals to the nerds. But what kind of saves these play against the board style games from kind of collapsing in on themselves is the fact that they are even people who are casual gamers, since you're all on one team against the board, no one feels like they've been cheated, or that they're at a disadvantage for not knowing the rules or not power gaming. A betrayal betrayal at the house on the hill is another great one. It's a very simple one. That one has an added dimension of mystery. I highly recommend that one. And then there's always Arkham Horror, which is my favorite. There's an Arkham Horror card game, which is another one that's a little bit a deeper cut, but it's also a really good one too. Ben White, for his customary dating update super chat, Ben White for $3 USA. Got a date happening this weekend. I pray that God's will and not mine be done. She's not Catholic, so it may turn out to be a waste of time, but hey, no harm in trying, right? Yeah, I mean, when you're, I dated secular women for a while, and what you're looking for, and I ended up marrying a woman who was very Catholic, and so I guess the sort of unequally yoked situation was never a problem for me specifically, but what you're looking for in women is openness to your worldview. If you ask them about religion, and you kind of get like the curled upper lip and the looks of disdain, or if you get complaints about family members that are that religion, that's a big red flag. That means that they already have anti-religious sentiment, anti-religious ideology taken on board, and you can take a woman and you can rid them of that. The younger, the better. As a man, that's an option you have, but it's that's extreme sports, guys. Not for the faint of heart. You're really taking on a Herculean task, especially in this day and age. What you really are looking for is women who are open to your worldview. If it's apathetic, that's a yellow flag, but you can I don't think there's yellow flags, orange flags, right? Yellow cards are from soccer, right, or from football, as the Europeans that call it. If it's apathetic, that's not a good sign. But a really good sign is, oh wow, that's really interesting. If she says that, that's actually really good, because that means that she is herself a seeker, and your devout religious belief makes you interesting to her, which means that you can actually teach her things about the religion in question. And anytime you're teaching a woman about something, that's like mansplaining is a prime mode you want to be in, because when you're acting as a teacher, you're demonstrating strength to a woman, and you're offering her something that's wholesome and good, and you're also putting her in a position where she can let her femininity kind of take control, and you get into that dance where you're leading and she's following, and you're paying and she's receiving. That's exactly the mode you want to be in. That's the exact mode you want to kind of train the relationship to be in eventually. And if she's receptive to learning about your religion, I would just go for it. So thank you very much. Next super chat from Ben White also. Ben White for $3 USA. Got a date... Wait, that's not the right one here. I'll reselect that. Maybe it will... Oh, this is the whole question thing. I need to get rid of the questions tab. My engineer friend, Ben White says, my engineer friend makes $100K and can't pay off his loans, but he's calculated that using an income-based repayment plan means he doesn't have to pay off all the principal. Moral hazard is huge here. An income-based repayment plan. Well, I don't understand. How does the income plan, repayment plan work for him if he makes $100K a year? Is there some way that he's cashing in on the forgiveness? Or is the idea that he's just not going to repay it and he's using the plan to cover all of the interest so he never does have to repay it? I don't know. I mean, like, if you can figure out a way to not pay your student loans back, I mean, I know this is... The problem is, Ben White, we live in a society... I mean, for your own moral virtue, pay back your student loans or have a plan to pay back your student loans. I'm trying to do that with my wife's student loans right now. And even as somebody who makes a not low amount of money, it's difficult with the expenses of a child and all that. But by all means, do it for your own moral edification. But insofar as, like, talking about moral hazard, the moral hazard of debt in, like, are you aware of what our financial system is? Our entire financial and government system, along with our bureaucracy, is a towering pile of false promises and politicized bailouts and forgiveness to cronies to no end. We are so far... The moral hazard under that colossal pile of shit is buried so far down that it would take generations of us shit diving to get to it and pull it up to the surface again. I can't care about the moral hazard of people who aren't paying about student loans. It's not my job to impose that on other people. I guess it's my job to make sure that people who are paying back their loans out of moral edification, out of moral righteousness, are made whole. That they're not screwed over. They're not the only ones who are doing this. That they can get their money back from the government. But if this repayment of loans is just being absorbed into the heat death of the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, then it's just part of the heat death of our own civilization. Believe me, it's not going to be even in the shadow of some of these larger outcroppings that come from entitlements and increasingly our desire to fight foreign wars with foreign militia, with foreign militaries. So I don't know, Ben White. I mean, like, you know, by all means, people who paid back their student loans should be asking to get bailed out as well for the exact same amount of money. But I'm not here to make the Federal Reserve's solvency crisis go away. I just can't be the advocate for that. It makes no sense for dissidents to be the defenders of the Federal Reserve's solvency problems. We can complain about inflation. But the complaints about inflation are largely just complaints to delegitimize the government. There's no way that you can actually fix this problem. We're way past that at this stage. I don't see what the utility is of making ourselves the owners of that problem. So anyway, thank you very much. TN1000. Yeah, really, is that name just to try to get me to activate my famous California lisp I really think that that person is trying to draw that out. But anyway, TN 1000 for $3 USA. You were talking about Bojack Horseman and Rick and Morty a while back. I've dropped Rick and Morty, but I still find myself oddly coming back to Bojack Horseman. I don't think there's something there. I do think that there's something there under the woke surface. Well, yeah, because I think Bojack Horseman, in Bojack Horseman, the characters are actually autobiographical sketches of the people who are writing it. And because of this, you end up having confessionals inside of it. A great example of this is ContraPoints. Bojack Horseman. So for those of you who don't know, Bojack Horseman is about it's in this stupid fictional universe where anthropomorphic animals coexist with humans, but no one ever comments on the fact that they're anthropomorphic animals. And the story of Bojack Horseman follows the career of a washed-up ex-sitcom actor called Bojack Horseman in his attempts to become relevant again, even though he's only had a bit role in a sitcom that was briefly popular in like the early 90s. Think of like Bob Saget, but he's like a horse. And so this is And so the movie or the TV show explores the consequences of being a minor celebrity. I think I watched like 5 episodes of it before I got really tired of it. I didn't particularly like the character very much, and I didn't see what the point was. But it did have the authors were trying to make some relevant observations about what the human condition was in modernity. Another good example of this is, I know I talk about this person a lot, but ContraPoints. ContraPoints is, it's so funny because all her recent videos, if you read the subtext, they make these very cogent observations about how the left is a complete dead end, how it's just a pathway to addiction and meaninglessness, how there is no there, and how it's a formula for crashing your own life into a total mess. But it has to be hidden behind this framing of, oh no, the problem is really Republicans. The problem is really our social security system is not generous enough. Our entitlement system could be expanded. We need to be more like Sweden. We need to be more like Germany. If anyone hasn't noticed, even Sweden and Germany aren't looking very much like Sweden and Germany as when it comes down to the leftist tropes of Sweden and Germany. But they the problem is the problem with both of these things, Bojack Horseman and ContraPoints, is if you're looking for sincere observations about the human condition, you're going to have to be very, very satisfied with picking up these observations and choice truths in the small moments of the movies you see or in the subtext. Because there's never going to be broad catharsis. There's never going to be full texts that points to the gaping holes in the problem of modernity. Because if they do that, the show ends. The show critiques itself into non-existence, and it has to abolish itself. It's like Kurt Cobain. I mean, or maybe more like David Foster Wallace. You can maintain irony for only so long until you're forced into a mode of sincerity. And when you're forced into a mode of sincerity, you have to concede that in many ways the modern project is a complete fraud, and we're all people awaiting something. We're all people either envying the Amish or awaiting something, a new order that will allow us to live more like the Amish. I'm going to say marginally more like the Amish, more authentic existences, in a mode where a lot of modern assumptions have to be completely destroyed. But ContraPoints can't say that, and Bojack Horseman can't say that. And so, I mean, if you're satisfied picking up these little insights smuggled into the subtext, sure, there is that there. But increasingly, that's not enough for me. I'm fine. I'm aware that ContraPoints knows that their entire existence as left-wing content creators is an incredibly is basically fake all the way through. But I kind of got over that revelation about them. It's not interesting anymore. Give me a phone call when they're actually willing to wake their own fans up out of their own delusion that they themselves have built. And Bojack Horseman's the same way. I mean, Bojack Horseman's in the metaverse, and does he want to wake up? Can he? I don't know. Aristocratic Owl gave me some good recommendations for a microphone, because this microphone I'm using now sounded so tinny on my last live stream. I recently put a pop filter on it, but I don't know if this has actually fixed the problem. And I definitely do need to get a soundboard of some kind, because you can hear that I'm broadcasting from a loft. Aristocratic Owl for $3 says, you should do a conversation with default friend. He says default friended. I think he means default friend. She seems to have tons of experience dealing with internet subcultures from the beginning. Yeah, she's default friend. I should do a conversation with her about that. Default friend comes from that post-left community that I talk a lot about. I don't know if she's directly affiliated with the Red Scare people or with Angela Nagel or any of these people. Amy Therese. I don't know, or Malcolm K. Une or whatever. I don't know, but I always considered her to be part of that crowd. And she has a great podcast that I believe now is on Substack. But I've never been like a super fan, because it's very much in that internet historian mode. And I do value internet historians who go through past trends and ask, what have we learned from Tumblr? What have we learned from MySpace? What have we learned from the age when Reddit was cool, or from the age of Something Awful, or even before that? What did we all learn from HomestarRunner.com? I don't know. I think that, we learned what we learned, but I mean, what I want to know is what you're building right now. And I think that's always sort of there's a gap in her content there where that conversation should be happening. Right? What I think the dissident right is building right now is a network of conferences and journals and publications buttressed by a network of meetup groups on local areas. And then from there, a set of individuals that go out into their lives and say to themselves, okay, like, the old role is over. How can I be a force of optimism to find other people who want to build something that's healthy? And how do I know what's healthy? Well, for that, I can go back to what I've learned from the dissident right, what I've learned from Burnham and Francis and Molbug and Carlyle and Christianity and Aristotle. And I can use that to build something new that's healthy for my community, and I can plug that into a broader community that can help them, and we can see what we can build from there, and we can see what we can actually create from there. We can see what organization, what commitment is possible in this era where everything is hidden behind multiple layers of meta narrative and media and metamedia. But thank you for the suggestion. Nirvana VMaker for $5 USA. I don't think I'm going to really read out dollar amounts anymore. I think this kind of breaks the flow a little bit. I've noticed for many decades, this isn't broadcasting here, I've noticed for many decades, literary criticism has put a lot of effort. I've noticed for many decades that literary criticism has put a lot of effort into finding left-wing messages in clearly reactionary works. McCarthy, Melville, Poe, and O'Connor. When they can't, they simply discard the work, like Lovecraft or Kipling. Thoughts? Yeah, I mean, they did that. That's what they used to do. What you're describing, Nirvana VMaker, is the 1990s, and to a lesser degree, the early aughties version of literary criticism. Do they still do that? Because the problem is, like, literary criticism, like, it used to be like, okay, I'm gonna give you a book that you can read And then when you bring it up at your dinner parties, you're going to look really smart, and you're going to convince people that you're an intelligent person, and that you should be listened to because you've read all these interesting books. And now I'm quoting, was it Wilt Stillman's Cosmopolitan? Read literary criticism because you get the content of the book and also the correct opinion to have about the book. So that was always the point of literary criticism, is to sort of make you cultured through quickly, right? You don't have to do your own rumination. You have a guide to the rumination. But after 2008, or much earlier, probably after the 90s, the money isn't in convincing you that there are secret progressive messages in Edgar Allan Poe. All of the money is in broadcasting that you've discovered that Edgar Allan Poe and G.K. Chesterton and Thomas Carlyle are secret racists. And, we know that Kipling and Lovecraft and Carlyle and Chesterton probably were super double secret racists, some less secret than others. But by our standards, they almost certainly were. They believed that the demography of Europe should be left in place. Certainly they would have believed that. Some of them even said it explicitly. And that makes you an evil... I've been told by Adam and Sitch that not only makes you an evil ethno-nationalist, that means that you want to ethnically cleanse people. That they assured me that those two opinions are the exact same thing. But that's where the money is. And since that's been where the money has been for so long, millennials and Zoomers don't really care about resurrecting old books and convincing you that, guys, actually Infinite Jest is secretly based in progressive. You don't want to be the person saying that in a progressive Discord server. You want to be the person saying it's racist, sexist, homophobic, and we have to get really angry about that, because if you tell people that Infinite Jest or The Pale King or Gravity's Rainbow is really interesting and you got to read it because it will make you a better person, that puts you're really putting pressure on people to go out and actually read a book, which is not what people want to do. They want to get angry and they want to get self-righteous, and it's easier to call things sexist, racist, and homophobic. There is an avenue for the right, and I've said this many times, to do what the left did previously. There's an avenue for the right to make content doing literary criticism on left-wing works about how secretly based they are. Although sometimes, with that Athena Netflix special, I'm wondering if that's even possible. It looks like Netflix is literally, guys, it looks like Netflix has literally recreated the Camp of the Saints and is selling it back to progressives. Like, the progressives are now paying for Camp of the Saints, but this time woke. But like Camp of the Saints, but this time woke, is still Camp of the Saints. And it contains so many reactionary themes that me pointing them out feels like I'm insulting our intelligence right now. It's still explicitly broadcasting the downside of replacement level migration rates and the impossibility of just seamlessly integrating this into one whole French culture. That's impossible now. French culture melts itself down to the lowest common denominator, or these broad ethnic coalitions are going to be eternally outcasts from the thick French culture that has, for the longest time, for hundreds and hundreds of years, been the pride of every Frank, Gaul, and Francophile the world over. And those are their two options. And they're probably not going to want to melt down their culture. Well, they might be forced to. So it's Camp of the Saints. and they can dress it up with Che Guevara hats as much as they want, but it's still Camp of the Saints. So I don't know. Maybe the left is just going to go so... They're gonna go so full Poe's law that they're going to... That literary criticism that finds the secret reactionary messages is going to be insultingly stupid, an exercise that we can all do ourselves. But I still think that there is a role for us pointing out the obvious, pointing out that ContraPoints' YouTube career is a criticism of the left, if you really read into it, pointing out the fact that the celebration parallax means that literally reactionary ideas are being sold to progressives as progressive ideas, and the joke's on them. I don't know. Maybe I find those takes to be kind of useful. The problem is that the right still hasn't learned the proper way to react to leftists consuming this stuff. They still get angry at the left for consuming this stuff when we really should be laughing at them. We really should be laughing at their stupidity, consuming this stuff. The issue obviously always is that the text itself eventually will do they'll perform a move that will save their own progressive audience from the reactionary implications of their own work. So I haven't actually watched this series, but I've been told that the HBO miniseries The Boys, which is a critique of cape shit or superhero movies, like where all the superheroes are evil, sociopathic internet celebrities. I've been told by people who like that series that there are a lot of choice reactionary critiques that are smuggled into it that you can find. But what happens is that the creators understand that they're making these criticisms. They understand that they can't make these criticisms, and so they smuggle. They don't smuggle. They broadcast their progressive ideology at the end of the season, so that there's no doubt that you are inside the progressive moral vision, really as an afterthought. And they ruin the coherency and the subtlety of their own universe, and they make it into a self-parody. But they also make it. They save progressives from secretly being laughed at by fans that can read cultural subtext. So I thank you, Nirvana V Maker, but I'm going to move on. Okay, so again, I'm going to go to Aristocratic Owl. Do you think the ideological purity of the dissident right has been the real downfall in any sense, and in a sense has indicated its own destruction, and reconstruct something that can unify people in the way they can stand against the regime? I don't think there's... What ideological purity are you thinking is the downfall of the dissident right? Like I said, the dissident right contains pagans and pickup artists, much to my own chagrin, because I think that they have an incoherent worldview that is gonna confuse people into pursuing unhealthy lifestyles, and it will capsize our attempt to build communities. But what do you? The problem is, I need to ask a follow-up question, Aristocratic Owl. What are you imagining? If anything, it wasn't ideologically pure enough. The point of the dissident right is to destroy normie conservatism and its pretensions to actually conserve anything. If we ditch the ideological purity and somehow invite Ben Shapiro's talking points back in, then that's failure, because now we're just going to be the Republicans 2.0. It's like what Aaron McIntyre said on a recent stream. He'll tell people you need to do X, Y, and Z, and they'll say like, well, we'll never be able to sell X, Y, and Z to our coalition, and that will never pull well. And then Aaron McIntyre says, well, you're going to lose. And that's the same thing here. I mean, like, you can ignore the stuff. You can make your coalition really, really broad to include normie conservatives, all their mistakes intact, and then you're going to get George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan again, and nothing's going to be accomplished. There's no point in doing that. If the dissident right cannot destroy the Republican brand conservatism, National Review conservatism of the 1990s. If it can't destroy that, then it's been useless. As for pushing back against the regime, I don't know if you mean this, but your comment is belying like somehow there's going to be a popular pushback against the regime. There cannot be a popular pushback against the regime. There can be popular stopgaps. There can be popular movements that buy you time, that get you resources, that allocate more of the state funds be given to you and less to your enemies. All that can be accomplished with popular movements. But there can be no ultimate ideological victory because there is currently no elite that can plausibly obtain power in a realistic way, and there's no plausible recipient of power from the regime. Before the stream started, someone asked me to do a retrospective on Gorbachev, who died today. Rest in peace. My condolences to his family, even though I didn't know him, so who knows? Well, obviously I didn't know him. But Gorbachev was famously the person who dismantled the Soviet Union through reform. He was a reformist, a premier. Was it a premier? Was that the right word? I think it was premier at that stage. Chairman of the Politburo or whatever. And he basically reformed away all of the controls that the Soviet Union needed to maintain itself, and which resulted in Boris Yeltsin and the fall of the Iron Curtain and all that stuff. What the problem is, what makes our discussion of Gorbachev unrealistic is that when Gorbachev reformed the Soviet Union, he was basically just giving power away from the East to the West. There is no equivalent organization or center of power that is ready to receive power in that way in the West or anywhere else in the world. And because of that, and the cathedral knows this, and it really wants to prevent an alternative power center from existing. So because of this, you can't push back against the regime in the way that you're implying in this tweet. The dissident right needs to destroy normie conservatism, and then it needs to foster, as best it can, successor communities that actually have pure ideological origins, that actually are organized around constant and eternal things. That's the path of its life cycle. And if it can do that, then it will succeed regardless of how ideological pure it is. And if it can't, then what was the point of it to begin with? So that's my answer, Extra Critical. Window lit for $10, like the famous music video. I said this on Pedro's tweet, with the phase of bashing conservatives over the head with the negative vision, clear them out, may be over. But the next phase will be creating the positive vision. Also, off topic, did you happen to see an interview with Shia LaBeouf by Bishop Barron? No, but I heard that he converted to Catholicism, in which case God be praised. I hope that he is constant in his pursuit of Christ and God, and that this is not some kind of celebrity fad like Anne Rice. Anne Rice was a famous celebrity convert to Catholicism in the early 2000s that totally embarrassed earlier fans of hers. She was fully embraced by, I think it was the First Things crowd back then. Maybe I'm thinking of something else. But then she totally, in 2012 or something, I think she totally apostatized and called all Orthodox Catholics homophobic because they didn't support gay marriage. This stuff is, you don't want to put your faith in celebrities. You don't want to put your faith in celebrities. I mean, maybe if they've really shown their credentials and you know that they're not going to stab you in the back, but going all in on Anne Rice and then having that resolve in apostasy so publicly was a huge embarrassment for people. And so I really encourage people not to do that. Celebrities are by their very nature mercurial, and you don't want to trust them. They don't deal in a world of solid ideas and constant application. And so oftentimes they chase what's cool and they burn off really quickly. So we'll see. If you're an authentic non-progressive, then you have to be comfortable with being hated. And celebrities aren't comfortable with that. Their entire career is organized around not being that. So of course, the second they get pressure, a Republican administration comes into power, and it's no longer hip to be square. They flake out, Yeah. So on your other part of your tweet window, like you're right. I don't think Clear Them Out is ever going to get old, because Clear Them Out is the broad organizing coalition for the right that intersectionality is for the left. And broad and umbrella terms are almost always negative, not positive. This will characterize the dissident right for as long as it lives, but it hopefully at some point it will die when the dissident right is abolished by positive visions. The problem here, or window is, again, everything you're saying is correct. Clear Them Out, it's kind of getting a little old, but it will probably never be unnecessary because it's what organizes us. And you're true that the next task is creating a positive vision. But the implication that stands behind this, the way you phrased it, is it sounds like what you're going to be promoting is that there's going to be some kind of umbrella positive vision. Curtis Yarvin has floated this idea with this sort of vitalism concept, the minimum necessary, the minimum viable religion, as Alex Kashuta paraphrased it, I believe. I don't think Curtis Yarvin paraphrased it that way. I do not think that this is possible, because minimum viable religion does not generate fanatics. And in order to be fanatical about something, you need dedication. And that can only occur on a small scale not on a small scale, but on a particular thing. So, you can't just we're all vitalists now. What does that even mean? If a vitalist includes me and Bronze Age pervert who thinks that, I'm a cuck for being a Christian, and, pagans who think that, I'm some kind of pseudo Zionist or something like that because the religion came from Palestine, what you can call all of those things vitalist, in the sense that we all share a certain kind of style, but there's no positive vision in all of that. There's a pile of contradictions, and the things that we bequeath will not be going in the same direction. Now, that being said, I think that some things will just have to be defeated. I think some of these, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be in tandem, a lot of different traditions that are going to be doing their own thing, and they're going to be in broad alliance with each other. Some ideas are just dead ends. I won't name the ones that I think. I'll name one. I think the whole pickup artist thing. I think that thing is very rapidly nearing its expiration date. It doesn't have a coherent answer for questions that are brought by its right-wing critics. And, I think that thing's just destined for the dustbin. As an ideology, right? There always will be cads. Don't get me wrong. But, as an ideology, I think that thing's just dead. But I think just, I want to cure people of this idea that we're all going to retreat to the Schilding's conference and then we're going to emerge like the Council of Nicaea and say, this is the positive vision. One caveat, though, I think what might be generated are a set of ideological norms and thought patterns and rules of engagement. This is something that's already emerging. Is if you go to one of these conferences, like the Vuitton conference that we recently held, I wasn't there, so I don't know. But I imagine if it had the same general mode as the Schilding's one in the U.S., basically everyone is welcome from any religious tradition, pagan, Christian, Muslim. I don't think there are many Muslims or other Abrahamic religions. There are one or two other Abrahamic religions there, and you're all welcome. But what's necessary to maintain is a certain style of thought and a certain academic and a certain code of honor. And so what persists in these communities is sort of a warrior honor that stops us from becoming a circular firing squad long enough for us to share our beliefs in what's true, good, and beautiful, and learn from each other to discover what comes next. It's almost like a parlay between different armies all operating under the same warrior code. There's a civilizational ethos that guides us to all work together as an academic community, even though we are most certainly not a religious community or an ideological community, and for that reason cannot, strictly speaking, be Promethean as a whole. I think that what this includes is that we do not counter-signal using the left's pieties. You could say that we don't punch right. If I have a problem with a pickup artist, I don't call him a misogynist. I point out where he's wrong and where his ideas might be destructive to the larger goal of creating healthy families and healthy Christian men and women. If I have a problem with an ethno-nationalist, I don't call him racist. I point out the problems with nationalism and the need for coming up with something that will work inside multi-ethnic communities and not just facilitate chaos. And so there's this understanding that you do not counter-signal using the left's language and the left's tools, and you do not cooperate with the cathedral's attempts to cancel people. Absolutely no cancel vultures, and you don't dox people, and you don't betray people, and you don't obviously advance bad faith arguments. I think, I know I admitted that I was watching Adam and Sitch's live streams the other day, and I fully admit that Academic Agent is right about them. There's no evidence that they're good faith actors because they've demonstrated multiple times that they don't care about what's true or not. They don't care that they're stringing people along in bad faith arguments and misrepresenting people's arguments. I mean, just this the leap that Sitch did. He heard Nick Fuentes say that he thought white people should have their own country. Funnily enough, 100 years ago, white people, the broad ethnic group called indigenous Europeans, had many countries that they called their own, right? So this isn't exactly, and when this was the reality 60 to 100 years ago, this is hardly a radical reimagining of the world. And so just translation of that was Nick Fuentes wants to ethnically cleanse the United States. The dude didn't frickin' say that, nor is one statement logically equivalent to the other. And furthermore, I'll go forward as Sitch knows that. And this is one line of a whole long line of misrepresentations that in piecemeal wouldn't disqualify Sitch as being a good actor because he doesn't do them as frequently as Vosh does and make it obvious. But the history of that means that I just can't do business with this person. If I were to invite him onto the stream, and I entertained it, it would piss Academic Agent off, and he's a good friend. But what would I do? I would understand immediately that the whole point is just to humiliate me and to categorize me as something that can easily be dismissed by his audience so they can feel more secure in their totally incoherent 90s style liberalism. That makes absolutely no sense given what we've seen post 2012. It has absolutely no future for anyone who has their eyes open to what's actually going on. And so I think that being said, I think a certain standard of quality, a certain standard of ethics, academic ethics, and a certain understanding of warrior ethics, so that a variety of people who fight under different flags can come together and all help each other fight more ethically and fight more beautifully and pursue what we share. The things that we share is the true, the good, and the beautiful. We can pursue those in common, even if they differ in certain critical ways. Okay, I spent a long time on that one. So Trey 50 Daniel for 10, but this is never accurate. We have to plant trees that we will never sit under and document this for the next generation to learn these lessons. Yeah, that's basically it. Yeah, and I think it's more the trees than the lessons. I think some people will learn some lessons. I think we can document what a dying society looks like so that people will believe it more this time than they did the last time this happened. But they'll never know what it was to live through this era. They'll never know what it is to live through the 90s and then see it decay so quickly. And to see it, what looks like a solid civilizational order just cannibalize itself into absolute incoherency. I mean, people will understand that we wrote these things and we said these things, we experienced these things, but they'll never believe them. They'll always think that we are old fuddy-duddies just trying to maintain an old order, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it. When St. Augustine, I mean, he didn't say these exact things, right? But when he pointed to the corrupt Roman order that was crumbling around him and said, oh, you shouldn't be loyal to the city of man, you should be loyal to the city of God. How many people actually heard that? Even people who were predicting a collapse of the secular world order in the 2000s, how many people heard that and actually thought to themselves, Augustine, he's seeing what I'm seeing, and I need to follow him? They just thought, oh, well, he's a religious fanatic, and sure, he's looking at a dying society, and I'm looking at a dying society, but that doesn't mean that I can take what he said as actually like viscerally, observably real. He's not describing his lived experience. He's describing ideology. Everyone's describing ideology a little bit when they describe their lived experience. But what I have come to suspect is that when a genius like Augustine or Dante is describing their world, and we can see the ideology, like they're describing it not as this is not really a performance. They're describing something that they're viscerally seeing in front of their faces. And the ideology is really coming in at a very subconscious level, and for that reason, I don't think future generations are going to doubt our sincerity about this. They'll never understand how sincerely we experienced the sudden turning. But yes, thank you, Trey. That is very correct. I'll move on since I'm only halfway through these things. I need to hurry up. And yeah, let's close up the super chats, guys. I'm at the end of the evening, so yeah, if you're gonna send them soon. I will probably be going a little bit faster now. Ben White, I've come to a theory that the regime can get normie leftists to support any policy, even one that doesn't benefit them long term, as long as they get drunk on the as long as they get to dunk on the conservatives. Do you feel similar? Yeah, I do. I mean, there's a certain type of person who buys this stuff. They love political theater so much that as long as they're dunking on the conservatives, they'll literally embrace their own doom. That's more or less what all of the Europeans who had Ukrainian flags on their bios just did in the last 12 months. They were told they were doing that, and they did that, right? Yeah, they were my favorite meme was the domino meme, where the first small domino is some autistic girl, Greta Thunberg, skips school, and the final domino is complete famine and energy loss across Europe. That's what we're looking at, an absolutely economically devastating energy crisis, if not a food crisis, in the next 6 months in Europe. And the response to this, and people are still, okay, well, can we dunk on Vladimir Putin? Did we stick it to him hard enough? How about green energy? Have we signaled that we want more of that hard enough? Have we taken enough fertilizer away from the farmers? Have the Dutch farmers suffered enough? Have we made them pay the price enough for their backwards kulak ways? Have we felt self-righteous enough for that? That's how they think. And the problem is that this product is becoming less and less appealing. It will always sell to sort of not very curious midwits, or not very curious, for lack of a better word, dim people. But increasingly is not selling to intelligent people or curious people or people who have genuine concerns for the future. This stuff is way past its expiration date. And if Europe actually does experience an economic catastrophe, as looks like is building right now, if it actually experiences that this winter, there'll be a lot fewer people coming back for more later. I mean, we've never seen this process exist when the internet's been as big of a thing. But reality is going to reassert itself in a real way. And when it does, the Midwest it's not going to be fun to do politics anymore. It's not going to be fun to dunk on the chuds. And people will actually they'll actually start asking questions that they want serious answers to. Aristocratic Owl for $10 USA. The false conception that the old world will be restored is true, but this also is true about the old religious order of any traditional version of Christianity. As Jonathan Pajau put it, we live in an age where Christianity is also adapting to the current problems of the world and will be different. I agree with you to a certain extent, Aristocratic Owl. Christianity will be different. But I do think that there is a difference between there's a difference between truly eternal things and transient things. The orders of this world can and do pass away. The realities of the spiritual world do not. And I say this thinking about the Christians before and after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Christians before the fall of the Roman Empire were very, very different than the Christians that emerged in the 13th and 14th centuries after the Dark Ages had well and truly fallen away and Europe had restored itself. They were very, very different. Christianity had changed, but there was an eternal dimension that maintained itself throughout the entire endeavor. I mean, unless you're saying that we just, if your point is nothing's eternal, maybe that's the case. Maybe the only constant is change itself, and we all should be something approaching Buddhists, less so Stoics. But if you actually believe in eternal things, which, not that this is a reason to believe in eternal things, but I will point out all successful civilizations have. I don't want to try to bribe you with realism, but, I'll just throw that tidbit out there. If we actually believe in eternal things, then we have to believe that the fall of the old world is not going to destroy the core truths of Christianity. Even though that might just be the Nicene Creed, even though that just might be God, that eternal reality has to be maintained. Here, you see Jonathan Pajau, and not Jonathan. Originally, I thought you said Jonathan Bowden. But now that Jonathan Pajau is an Orthodox Christian, and I think he might agree with me when I say this. The Christianity is going to change to a certain degree. But be suspicious of the person who brings that to you as a reason to reform something in the church. Remember always the Lindy, or the Lindy effect. The old thing has a much, much, much higher probability to be a reflection of the true eternal thing than it is the new thing. And so the reformer is much more likely to be a charlatan than the traditionalist. Whereas, the same is not true for the political order. The person who announces the death of the old Western political order is just speaking truth, and the person that's trying to preserve it is selling false hope. So I mean, I totally feel you, aristocratic owl, and I think we might be on the same page. But that truth you're speaking right now, it belies a fundamental difference in quality that come from people conserving religious traditions and people conserving political orders that I think really needs to be respected. And that again is implicitly lying behind that super chat that I want to clarify. Ori Samsonov, a pure contribution for $5. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it. Our favorite Israeli. Our favorite nationalists. I'm not a nationalist, but I respect nationalists of all varieties. Caden McCormick for $3 USA. I was heavily inspired by your culture war and content creation leadership video, but much has changed in 3 years. Would you have an addendum or side note relevant to 2022? Thanks. That's an excellent suggestion. I would love to write a Substack post on that, but I might have to write that more towards the middle of 2023. I was really hoping to write something like that after I spent some time revisiting old places in the West Coast, and I missed that opportunity. But I'll try to definitely do that. I need to get out more. What can I say? But thank you very much. It's an excellent suggestion, and that's definitely on my list of my long list of things to do. Rasmus Jensen, book recommendation. This one has been rediscovered by some normies as the new great American classic, but despite that, it's actually problematic. Stoner by John Williams. It's the story of a lowly English literature professor, William Stoner, taking place throughout the first half of the 20th century. I have never heard of that book. Stoner by John Williams. That is... Okay, I mean, I'm very few books I hear of for the first time, especially when they're described as instant classics. But I'll give that a look. I'll look that up. That's great. I read very slowly, so it's going to be a while before I'm done with it at a camera on. But I'll give it a look. Ham Sparde for USA $3. Let me put that up really quickly. What's your opinion on open source and also minimalist software? I've read it's been... what is your opinion on open source and also minimalist software? I've read that it's been found that there is one bug in 1,000 lines in the best code. One bug per 1,000 lines in the best code. Okay, so I assume this is minimalist. So this is like suck less software. You hear a lot about this from... Well, I'm a big open source person. I love open source software. I'd like to think that open source software creation is a tradition that communities hand down inside themselves. So that there's like communities... Like Git would be like a thing for the ages. So religious communities would have their own software that they hand down in repositories and their own servers maintained throughout the ages, like the ancients preserved libraries. And I like to think they have their own coding standards that would include standards of ethics. You can imagine this being handed down in various different versions of GitHub. I don't think we're any way. I don't think that the distant right is anywhere near having their own GitHub equivalent. And software projects for the moment have all been limited one-offs. So we're very far away from that right now. But I love the open source community. The open source community is absolutely full of bugs, though. I think as you're alluding to right now. And it's absolutely full of bugs, and because of that, I think that's the appeal of minimalist software, right? Less code, less bugs. But yeah, I encourage everyone that follows me to get into that scene. I run almost exclusively Linux. I think exclusively Linux. I don't know if I have a Windows machine anymore. I think I do. I think it's dual booted, but the one thing I used in Windows was Adobe Premiere, and I stopped using that because I stopped making sort of complex videos. I might come back to it for some videos I have on the docket, but it will be a while. Okay, Antimatter Bone Crusher for $10. A small observation, but watch the '05 depth version of Willy Wonka with the kids. Terrible, I know, but I still enjoy the quaint right-wing theme that the kids naturally have impulses that deserve tough consequences. Could only be made now with kids being racist, homophobic, xenophobic, etc. Oh my god, that would be horrible. Yeah, I can already imagine the cringe version, the cringe woke version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where every one of the kids just has a different version. It really works for Zach TV, doesn't he? Could be like a 4chan nerd, and Veruca Salt could be a total like a prepubescent version of Karen or whatever, right? God, that would be cringe. I always felt that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was like 7 Deadly Sins, but for children. In typical Roald Dahl form, all of the children who are not Charlie have these exaggerated defects, character flaws in them. And they're all punished as a way of showing children that they shouldn't have those character flaws. And this is, of course, way, way, way out of fashion. I alluded to that in some early, like Max and Moritz, right? Max and Moritz get ground down, not into hamburger. I think they get baked into pies. But in very Sweeney Todd, they have mortal consequences for their wickedness. But that's very much out of fashion. People don't realize, and Roald Dahl realized this, but people don't realize that kids are totally fine seeing other children have horrible things happen to them for moral defects, and it really does enforce moral behavior. I think this is just a defect in our own politicized child psychology. What kid doesn't like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or Matilda or any of these? I mean, even Harry Potter, right? I mean, for all of her wokeness, J.K. Rowling gave us a boarding school of young wizards where she had an entire school, she had an entire subset of her wizarding school was dedicated to irredeemably racist 8-year-olds. House Slytherin was just this group of irredeemably Nazi preteens. so it's it's funny. Iron Duke 99. Dave, I would like to thank you and your good lady wife for adding a dramatic bit to your stream. Good stuff and cool to see you check she was okay. Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for the super chat. I'm going to move right along because I am very much out of time. Here's a question I get a lot. Any advice for an aspiring engineer? So this is one of my, I always say this, always be building. So are you in college yet or not? I don't know. I mean, try to get, if you're not in college, be aware of weeder classes and don't be, first of all, if you're going into college, don't be afraid of doing 2 years in a community college and then going, there's 3 pieces of advice. Okay, first, before college, don't be afraid of community college, 2, and then completion at a 4-year school. You can get into some really good schools that way and half the total amount of student debt you have to pay back. B, when you're in college, worry about grades a little bit, like get good grades relative, try to stay on the upper end of the, beat the average, so to speak, but don't agonize over like A minuses or B pluses or anything else like that. What you want to do in college is build a portfolio, whatever you're doing. If you're in civil engineering, join the bridge project. Learn welding. If you're a mechanical engineer, work on the electrical vehicle project. Or if you can, work for a professor and get your name on a publication, if you possibly can. Always be building and facilitate a portfolio. The portfolio will set you aside more than your grades will, for the most part. And always do stupid little things like get your EIT. It's so easy. The test isn't that hard. It's, you do a test prep and you'll do fine on it. And it will be a little star. And then once you're out of college, keep in mind getting a master's degree is probably worth it. Getting a PhD probably isn't, for the most part. But the number one thing you need to have as an engineer, the number one problem engineers have when they get out and into the workforce, I'm going to be really frank with you. Engineering is boring. It's boring and it's not particularly fulfilling. And it doesn't mean don't not try to enjoy your job, take pleasure in your work, take pride in your work, be professional, and it pays the bills, and it pays the bills really well. And it certainly beats working at Starbucks. And sometimes you work on really fun projects and you really get into it. And as always, you can be a resource to people, and being the guru at your company is pretty good when you can help people out and build things that genuinely help people. But a lot of times you end up on projects you don't believe in, doing work that is essentially trial and error experimentation with a side order of number crunching and a little bit of research. And that's a lot of engineering projects right there, that combination. And that's not very fulfilling. You need to have a dimension of your life that if your job is not fulfilling generally, or going through a period where it's not fulfilling, you don't go insane. You need a community of people that are your friends, hopefully a religion to give you meaning. And then also, if you possibly can, an outlet where you can build something that you're proud of. Either an engineering project that's in your field that you're working on that you really believe in, like a research project, or working on a car, or you need to have like a hobby like this right now, like a blog that you really, really believe in. That even though your job might not be making you feel like a rock star, you have this to fall back on the days where you spent the entirety of the day tinkering with something and it didn't work. A lot of people don't understand in engineering that the toy problems you get in high school and college are not like real engineering problems. Real engineering problems, like 99% of the time, they just fail. And so you have days where it's just like failure. Like your tinkering just doesn't work. And you need to be able to survive those days with some amount of meaning. And also a lot of engineering jobs just aren't fun. And because of student debt and because of the fact that you're supporting a family, you have to work at them for a few years before you can find something that's more fulfilling, or before you can move. You need to have something to come home to that is not just like an empty apartment in video games. Just don't do that to yourself. Like, you'll crash and burn, and you'll do something stupid professionally that's going to hurt you in the long term way more than just having a work-life balance that's sensical. Glow in the dark for $5 USA. Bojack Horseman subtext is there's no solution in left-wing ideology for depression or any other thing. Just as momentary reprieves from hedonism that will make you feel like shit afterwards, or some BS guru hippie drivel that makes no sense under analysis. And then that was actually the impression that I got from like the 5 Bojack Horseman episodes that I watched. That the subtext of it was a very Jordan Peterson one, that politics and ideology and hedonism are just dead ends. The problem is that the people who make this are leftists. More importantly, the people nipping at their boot heels and the corporate ladder at Cartoon Network or whoever makes this, they're all dumber leftists than they are. And eventually, they're going to realize that they're basically just preaching Jordan Peterson ideology. As people like Jordan Peterson increasingly find themselves on the right, Bojack Horseman, in its subtext, is going to start sounding more right-wing. And then it's going to start losing its left-wing ant smell. And then, because of the left we've created from the shift in criticism that I pointed out earlier in the super chats, they're going to start attacking it and deconstructing it. And all of those up-and-coming minority content creators that really want a shot at the big time are going to realize that they have a tool to cancel their betters in Bojack Horseman and to pressure the corporate executives to make them write the endings. And then what you're going to have is an ending of Bojack Horseman where he discovers true socialism, or he discovers that he has to step aside so a minority can be more prominent in his position. And his sacrifice for the cause gave him meaning. I promise, guys, like Matt Christman said, I promise if you give your life to the revolution, you will have meaning. It will be the meaning that Jordan Peterson promises you. Bullshit. Any political revolution's goal is to abolish itself. And if you're not emotionally prepared for the death of your own political movement, you've built your house on sand. But that's the fate of that might not be what Bojack Horseman is saying currently. That's what it will ultimately say based on the managerial nature of the corporate structure that has produced it. But thank you very much for the clarification. For those of us who did not know about Bojack Horseman, they know about it now, right? Cringewalker for $5 USA. I was reading a blog that argued we should describe this era as the opticratia rather than the autocratia. So it's like optics, like it's the rather than autocratia, it's opticratia. That's kind of catchy. Well, I don't think it is. That's incredibly hard. Opticratia it either sounds like autocratia or opticrapia. So I might disagree with you that it's catchy. But okay, I get the message. You know, we're all optics obsessed. It's always optics over content. Also, I've been told by many professors that the goal of philosophy is suicide. An abstraction becomes defined, it ceases to be a philosophy. Yeah, I don't know. I've never been really that deep into esoterics, but if a philosophy really resonates as truth, then it becomes the background radiation of the culture itself and becomes just wisdom. Hypothetically, the ultimate goal of philosophy is wisdom. The hypothetical goal of philosophy is to become so true that it becomes the background culture of society itself and no longer becomes novel. Now, I understand that Socrates and Aristotle and Plato are all somewhat novel, even though people still read them, right? But I think that a lot of the wisdom that they had got incorporated for a brief period of time in the high culture of the West, between like 1160 and 1960. And because of that, a lot of their insights for a while became default wisdom until they eventually now, I mean, you read Aristotle and he seems fresh and novel because we've unlearned a lot of basic truths that sometimes he was just reciting the common wisdom of his own era, and now it sounds novel and fresh. But yeah, I agree that there is that sort of self-abolitional nature inside philosophy, even if we discount sort of like the desire for death in the Freudian sense that your super chat kind of implied. Aristocratic Owl for $5 USA. Hurrying through these. Explain Christian point earlier. Christianity Christianized both Rome and Germanic Europe. It did not return back to the old Hebrew tradition. What you might see is Christianization of modern culture, and maybe even a certain type of subculture. I think that I'm going to, I'm not so sure I fully understand this, but yeah, I mean, Christianity is going to Christianize, if it's successful, if it survives, it will Christianize cyberculture. It will Christianize post-information culture. But part of that is going to be information restriction. Part of that is going to be masking ourselves from certain kind of poisonous signals and certain kind of addictive signals that we know hijack our instincts as humans. It will be a cybernetic Christianity, to borrow a Landian term, but certain core truths aren't going to change, and certain core realities aren't going to change. And the core realities of our own cybernetic era are that the human mind is hackable, and as such, certain pieces of information have to be treated more as poison than as critical arguments in some kind of no-hold-barred dialectic. And that has to be part of any religious tradition that successfully makes it out of the eye of the needle of modernity. It's going to be understanding that. I think Christianity will make. If I didn't think Christianity would make it out of the eye of the needle, why would I be Christian? And I think there's a hint that it will, inside the very irony that the eye of the needle is literally Jesus' own words. But thank you very much, Aristocratic Owl. Glow in the Dark for $3 reads feminist books saying men want to erase women. You see this is based because they're talking about trans women are better than women in sports and can't compete with men even in femaleness. So I think what you're saying is you read a feminist book saying that men want to erase women. This is also something that happened this week. There was a very funny Welsh Pride March in which a bunch of lesbians literally got escorted out of the march because they're being disruptive for yelling transphobic or turfy statements about the nature and definition of femaleness. Feminists have successfully abolished themselves by their own logic, and not in a good way. Women, not feminists, are about to realize that they've been epically effed over. I'm sorry, Glow in the Dark. Either your super chat's being jumbled, or the grammar is just not making sense to me. I can't put this together in the form of a question. You read a book that was by a feminist who understood that femaleness itself is being abolished because they're destroying the categories, and as such, women are going to lose all sporting. They're going to lose all of their own contests, either because intersectionality will demand the more oppressed group, trans women, be put over them, or because it's sports and they literally have a biological advantage. That's absolutely correct, Glow in the Dark. And women, I don't know. I mean, the question is, which women are going to realize just how thoroughly they've been screwed over by feminists? I can't honestly say. A lot of women, a lot of very smart women, are just enthralled to the religion of progressivism. It's won politically so much over the last 100 years that they're absolutely mesmerized by its power, and they can't conceive of betrayal. But at some point, at a biological level, when their spaces are being invaded by male-bodied individuals, they will begin to realize it. As it will be a dawning realization, but they will realize it, and it will return with a sharp, avenging irony. And our job as the dissident right is to make them realize that this is not trans people's fault. This is feminism's fault. This is progressivism's fault. Progressivism was always going to go in this direction. You cannot arrest its own logic from taking root. And of course, are you going to teach all women this? Almost certainly not. But you're going to teach the more intelligent among them this effectively. And women look up to each other. They learn from each other. And if the truth that this was always part of feminism is on the lips of the of leaders of female spaces, then eventually the rest will follow suit. So thank you very much, Glow in the Dark. Stone Flax Wrench for 777. I give you the award. I think you may have beaten out Window Lick for the name that sounds the most like an Aphex Twin song in the entire chat. But thank you, Stoneflex Wrench 777. I am having my first kid, a daughter, and my wife is going to stay home full time. I feel like I'm taking the training wheels off of life. Any advice for a first-time dad? Well, believe it or not, my advice for a first-time dad hasn't changed much in the last hour and a half. Would you believe it? I know nothing about having a daughter. I totally encourage your wife to stay home and be a full-time mother. Expect her in about 2 years to want to go back to work in a limited capacity. I think that I think really I said all about kids. Just be comfortable with being dirty. Lose your aversion to your kid's poo. Always be calm when your kid's crying. And yeah, what you're really taking the training wheels off of is your own marriage. And I'm going to put this in a blog, an actual Substack article at some point. But the more and more I realize this, all the things that pickup artists complain about, like shit tests, and pickup artists don't complain about this, but men do. Women wanting men to read their minds. These are all actually evolved female instincts. I'm not saying that the requests aren't unreasonable, but you certainly understand why women want men to read their minds and why women put men through shit tests. And that is because so much of your job as a husband, especially after a kid, is just monitoring. Your wife is making a lot of the decisions about the child that are kind of she has instincts about them and you don't, so you just defer to her. But what your job as a husband really is to sort of monitor your wife and try to catch the points where she's her own psychology is blinding her to a poor decision she's about to make. And you're supposed to stop her from making the decision with a veto. And so your ability to kind of read bullshit and dismiss it, or your ability to anticipate her making a mistake, like e.g. the wife's request for you to read her mind, that's actually sort of a core utility you have as a husband. Your job is to try to anticipate the mistakes her own mind is making. So you are kind of always trying to read it, right? You still forget things all the time, though. Anyway, Glow in the Dark for $3 USA. I will keep hearing from normies on the pendulum. I keep hearing from normies, oh, the pendulum will swing. So Glow in the Dark says, I keep hearing from normies that the pendulum will swing back hard and it will be just as bad but right wing. What would you guys say to them to tell them this thing won't go back to the way things were? Or the way the thing was. I don't know. I'm at some. This is what I was trying to communicate to Adam and Sitch. What do they? So the pendulum swings back and it restores. What year does the pendulum restore? 2005, 1995, 1985, 1955, 1925, 1825. What is the pendulum supposed to restore? Because every time we've seen a restoration, as in 1985 or 1995, the pendulum has always swung back to the left, twice as far left as it's swung back to the right, to the point where no one wants it to swing back because everyone realizes that it's just going to swing further to the left and they don't want to be on the losing side of the struggle. I've explained this so many times to centrists that I don't know what to say. And at this point, really, someone like Aaron McIntyre is more useful than I am, because I can give you an analogy and a complicated logical argument about why this has to be the case. I can walk you through the ins and outs of why Adam and Sitch's worldview doesn't coherently fit together, or if it does, it plainly ignores empirical reality. But really, Aaron McIntyre's message works much better, where he just retweets something and says, look at this, look at what's going on around you. Do you have any amount of pattern recognition? Can you see that the slippery slope is not a logical fallacy? It's literally just the Humean paradox of induction. And if you can't see that the sun setting every day since the beginning of time does not mean that it will set tomorrow, that it will set tomorrow, then you just have no concept of how to deal with the reality. I mean, really, if this is a conservative, I have no patience with them. I have no patience with them, because their movement's dying anyway. If this is a centrist like Adam and Sitch, I'll try to point this out as quickly and as basically as possible so their audience can understand. But I mean, the time is really, I mean, we're about to call time on centrism, I think, as well, because it's transparent that centrism is conservatism with a time lag. And then we have what progressives. I mean, these people just need to snap out of it. And what snaps people out of it is contact with reality. Social pressure won't do it. And I mean, arguments do to a certain extent, but what really arguments do more than anything else is, if you go into dialectic with a leftist, dialectics don't really work for the left very well anymore. What they have is character assassinations. And if you force them to conceptualize you as an honest person who's working through these problems and restate your own position to them honestly, 9 times out of 10 you've planted a seed of doubt that might, somewhere down the line, implode their worldview when hard reality begins to intrude. But thank you very much. I'm going to go on because we're at the end of this thing, and I'm way over time. Iron Duke 99 for $3. Dave, I like some people in the manosphere like Red Hawk. Much of it is male reaction to feminism. Well, much of it's male reaction to feminism. I would maintain that all of it's male reaction to feminism. And look, if it's just a reaction to feminism, totally get it. You're right. Game works. We just come into contact over certain things. Like recently, for instance, I think Red Hawk and I had a disagreement over a tweet where I don't exactly know what his take was, but he was pushing back on an article where a trad Catholic 22-year-old woman called off a marriage when she discovered that her fiance was lying to her and actually had a porn addiction going on the side. And he was criticizing this woman, I guess, because men... I didn't really understand it, but damned if I could find out what was wrong with this logic, because she was cutting off a relationship with a man who was deceiving her. I have a simple... I mean, this is not a sufficient condition. This is not a necessary condition for women's concerns to be valid, but it is a sufficient one. If a woman's concerns about a potential mate dovetail exactly with what a selfish patriarch's concern with a potential mate would be, even if that patriarch had completely mercenary interests and considered her just to be a female asset, if those dovetail exactly, then that is not an illegitimate concern the woman has. Would a patriarch, would her father tell her to dump a fiance who had lied to her about porn usage? I'd probably say, yeah, that's a good reason to reconsider the marriage. If that had been a deception at this stage. Would Red Hawk tell the same thing to his daughter? I hope he would. And if he doesn't understand the very ideology that he describes in his own work. So I don't know what to say. I mean, I don't know. I mean, like paganism. Like, I get the criticisms paganism has of Christianity, The problem is that when you try to reconstruct the alternative, the thing doesn't fit together macrocosmically. There's huge gaping holes in it. So it just becomes like a complaint and not an actual coherent critique. Cringe Walker for $5. Did you notice a few weeks ago that the mental locks of normie leftists started to break? Biden's polls crashed to 34%, and it looked like there was a loss of the message. Then suddenly they are universally coming back to the fold. I can't tell how. Well, Biden's performance hasn't increased. I think what you're talking about is this. What happened is that over the summer, leftist approval of Biden bottomed out. Because of his obvious incompetence. He's destroyed the economy. He's going to lose the war in Ukraine, it looks like at this stage. And he's totally mismanaged inflation. And it looks like his administration's wrong about a lot of his vaccine mandates, which he's admitting right now. Okay? It's a disaster on all fronts. And like rats leaving a sinking ship, the left abandoned him. Then the abortion ruling happened from the Supreme Court. And all the leftists got really paranoid, and they started looking around for reasons to support Joe Biden. And what they found was Dark Brandon, which is the cringiest meme. It's actually a successful meme because it does communicate a core truth. So Dark Brandon is a parody of Dark MAGA. Dark MAGA is a layup. So basically Biden, because he's trying to vilify the Republicans, guys, still super chats coming in, we have to taper those off. Because Biden was trying to vilify Republicans, he created this thing called Ultra MAGA, which is like, oh, we're going to come back twice as bad, and they'll still be MAGA. They'll be Ultra MAGA. And this was lampooned on the right by creating Dark MAGA, which is like Trump looking like Emperor Palpatine. And it's a joke because Trump doesn't look like Emperor Palpatine. And I guess it prefigured the understanding that a second Trump administration would actually go after the deep state, which to me, I really don't think it would. I really don't think... But that's neither here nor there. The hope that Dark MAGA actually would be vindictive. But then what happened was a few leftists turned this around, and they created Dark Brandon, which is like the exact same thing as Dark MAGA, but with Joe Biden, shooting lasers out of his eyes and cracking down on Republicans and being authoritarian. This meme actually is a successful leftist meme, but not for the reasons why they think it is. They think that it's successful because, Biden is actually secretly super competent. And even though he might be senile, he's in all of these great things that are making the economy better and making your lives better. And everyone loves him, even though he's like, people vilify him all the time. That's not true. Leftists don't think that's true. We all look at our bank accounts and see what inflation has done. We all look at the state of the economy in despair. We all look forward to the energy and food crisis and shudder. That's not what Dark Brandon actually communicates. What Dark Brandon communicates, and all memes are good because they're basic. And the left doesn't really have any basic observations of truth that aren't ugly and vindictive, so they don't have any good memes. But they do. This is a good meme because it hides the ugliness and vindictiveness behind the falsehood. The falsehood I mentioned about Biden being competent. The truth of Dark Brandon is this. Do you really care about the economy going to shit? Do you really care about American power declining? Do you really care about the fact that energy and food crises are ongoing and we have no solution and that crime is spiking out of control? You don't. All you care about is that we punish those chuds. We punish the Republicans. And that's what Dark Brandon is going to do. He's just going to punish the Republicans. So you can appreciate Joe Biden as an entertainment product who will punish the Republicans even as he drives the country into the ground. So enjoy it while it lasts, because you're not going to get any more of it. And, it's fresh, it's concise, and it's true. A perfect meme. It's a sociopathic one, but it's a great meme. And so now all the leftists are clapping like seals, and they've convinced themselves in the moment to support Joe Biden because he punishes their enemies, even though he's manifestly destroying the country. I don't know. Is Joe Biden... I need to walk that back a little bit. Joe Biden is not destroying the country. Decisions we've made for the last 40 years from the progressive movement mostly are destroying the country. Joe Biden is simply the avatar of that destruction and the unwillingness to arrest the process, but rather pour gasoline on the fire. And then, that's it. You de-elect Joe Biden, or you remove Joe Biden from office, those problems aren't going to immediately evaporate. So no Tucker Carlson fallacies here. Okay, Remini Copard for $3 USA. So I've been looking at images of the urban decay of Detroit. I'm wondering, is current Detroit just ahead of the curve of what the future of most Western cities will be? Well, I don't know. I used to live in a Detroit suburb, vaguely, and emphasis on suburb, pretty far away from Detroit Center, like very white area. Even far away from Dearborn. But Detroit is a city that it's basically a bunch of suburbs, white suburbs, surrounding a largely black city. And in the 80s and 70s, the city was just filled with crime. And when I lived there in the 2000s, it was just abandoned. It was largely a ghost city. It felt like a ghost city. There was one Greek quarter where there was active shops where you could actually go and get some good masaka. But other than that, nothing was going on in the entirety of the city. It felt like a ghost city. That probably will be true for a lot of cities in the Midwest. I don't think that will be true for San Francisco. I think San Francisco is going to have quarters that are active business areas, and it will just be a little bit more like a city like Rio or a city like Cape Town, where they're just areas that are utterly crime-ridden and then a bunch of gated communities. I think Latin America is a lot more indicative of what we can expect than sort of Detroit. Detroit was very unique because it had a few industries. Like, no one needed to come into town other than to work at these industries. And then once the industries left, everyone just moved to the suburbs, and the factories moved out of town anywhere where the land was cheaper, and then the whole city kind of continued as a donut, which is really bizarre. That can't happen to a city like Manhattan or a city like San Francisco. The donut would put all the people in the bay, and the transportation systems aren't good enough to make the donut work. So I think that those major metropolitan blue areas they're going to look a lot more like just plain third world cities with maybe a wealthier business district, but that's really the direction we're going. Okay, given Sam Hyde's recent... Leo John Gunig for $3 USA. Given Sam Hyde's recent boxing win, when are you challenging Vosh to a match? I don't know. I'll challenge him in like 5 years or whatever. I have my PhD weight on me. First of all, I'm not going to box anyone in my current state. I've got a bad back, and I'm pushing in on 40. I'm getting a little near on 40 here. This is not. I'm not in prime fighting shape, and Vosh is he's like 10 years old, younger than me too, right? I don't know. And in the same way that I, hypocrite, ducked out of a boxing match with Sam Hyde. I duck out of a boxing match. I might be able to beat Vosh if I trained or something like that, because I think that this. I don't think that he's particularly he'd do particularly well in self-discipline. But I don't know. It's just a silly thing. This whole YouTubers boxing each other. It's funny because it's cringe, because these people have no idea how to box. It's a horrible boxing match. And it's just silliness for silliness' sake. I appreciate the fact that people are putting their mouth where their money is. And I appreciate the fact that ideas should have consequences. And a man shouldn't assert something unless he's willing to throw a punch. And if some left-winger challenges me to a boxing match, I'd probably say yes and get my butt kicked if the person's significantly younger than me, because that's what happens if someone who's significantly younger than you or bigger than you fights you. I'd like to think that I'd say yes. But why not? I'm not a professional YouTuber here, so maybe it wouldn't fit into my work schedule. But I don't know. This stuff is just silliness. But Sam Hyde's performance was really funny, and it really called back to Andy Kaufman. But I'm not much of a boxer. I get my ass totally kicked. But it would be pretty funny. It would be pretty funny. So I will give you that. Sam153 for $3 USA. I've had some relapse interest back into the Titanic tragedy recently. I think 100 years from now, people will still be talking about the Titanic. Is it a perfect tragedy? Yeah, I guess the Titanic is kind of a perfect tragedy in the sense that it was sort of the height of our civilization it was before even World War I, which is where the civilization started going downhill. That's when the decline began in earnest, before it really accelerated in the 1960s. It was at the height of empire, the height of order, the height of technological grandeur, and in the middle of this, there was technological failure, and due to some kind of ridiculous oversights, an enormous amount of people died for really, reasons of incompetence, and it showed the hollowness of the whole thing. And so because of that, it has sort of a poetic dimension. Plus, I think that the James Cameron movie, it's schlocky, emotionally manipulative crap, but it has a high probability of being a piece of media that survives for a very long time, just because that schlocky emotional crap is just so unapologetically inhabits its own milieu, so to speak. It is what it is, and you can appreciate it for that. And so that might give the Titanic story another life. But I'm finally at the end of my super chats with Asteroidal Assassin. What is your advice for an artist author who does not have an interesting enough life to create truly interesting art and stories? Well, does anyone have an interesting enough life to create art and stories off of it? I think that's a pretty big stretch. Even the people that claim to write autobiographical stuff, like Jack Kerouac, you go back and you realize that most of it's highly fabricated. Here's two piece of advice I'd give you. First of all, you could do what all people of our generation do and just write sci-fi or fantasy, which is a very noble thing to do. You can always imagine interesting stories, and you learn that how to write stories by reading stories that other people have written in that genre. But I will say, if you are a true aspiring artist, you want to add a dimension of realism to your sci-fi and fantasy, and so it really helps you to write in a mode of realism, because writing in a mode of realism, or in contemporary realism, it basically just levels up your entire writing style, because it allows you to write what you know. I would really highly encourage everyone to read artists that write about contemporary stuff happening to people. People like David Foster Wallace, even though I haven't finished Infinite Jest, I'm a hypocrite for recommending this. People like Hermann Hesse was one of my old favorites. Even Jack Kerouac. I have a writer / radio personality, Joe Frank, who loved telling these elaborate shaggy dog stories in sort of a film noir beatnik style, which I really, really loved and got me interested in extended stories that took place in the contemporary world. You have to be interested in the world you inhabit insofar as you ask questions about it, insofar as you reach out and try to learn more about it, because interrogating landscapes and interrogating history and literally interrogating people is how you learn about how the dynamics of history and circumstances work. They say that truth is stranger than fiction. You can't really understand how the dynamics of truth work until you ask people to tell them your stories. I really encourage people do people still go out to bars and have beers and tell stories? I used to do that all the time in college. And it's a great time, but do people still do that? I'm sort of past that era of my life, but I think COVID might have killed that whole practice. But if you're an aspiring writer, listen to people. They have interesting stories to tell you. I have a fiction story, or it's creative nonfiction. Tales from a Middle Place, where I combine several stories that were told to me when I was living in the Detroit era. I combined a bunch of them together and create kind of a half fiction, half nonfiction story of my own that's very true to life and true to experiences people had, and in sort of an allegorical way, because obviously it's a combination of a variety of different stories. And I just encourage you to do that. But with that being said, the super chat version, the super chat era portion of our stream is over, and I'm here to read today the Psalm. And for those of you who were paying attention, the Psalm is Psalm 46. So it goes as follows: God is for us a refuge and a strength, a helper close at hand in times of distress. So we shall not fear what the earth should rock through the mountains and fall into the depths of the ocean, even though its waters rage and foam, even though the mountains be shaken by its waves. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. The waters of a river give joy to God's city, the holy place where the God of Most High dwells. God is within, it cannot be shaken. God will help it at the dawning of the day. Nations are in tumult, kingdoms are shaken. He lifts his voice, and the earth shrinks away. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Come, consider the works of the Lord, the redoubtable deeds he has done on the earth. He puts an end to wars over all the earth. The bows he breaks, the spears he snaps. He burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God, supreme among the nations, supreme on the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. So thank you. With those very brave words in a tumultuous world, I will thank you all for joining me for tonight's broadcast from Fiddler's Green. Have an excellent rest of the week and a blessed night. Thank you very much.